Hey dreamers, welcome back. Cozy up, hit like and subscribe, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more bedtime stories. Drop your location and time below. Take a deep breath. And let's begin.
I've always prided myself on being able to enjoy solitude. After years of living with roommates and noisy families, the silence of an empty house was almost a balm to my soul. I had finally moved into a small, old townhouse on the edge of a quiet suburb, a place with creaky wooden floors, long hallways, and a history that whispered through every corner. For the first few weeks, I reveled in the quiet nights and the freedom of having the entire house to myself. But there was something strange about the house. A persistent, unsettling sound that only emerged when the moon was high and the world outside was in deep slumber. I remember that particular night vividly. It was the kind of night that made you wonder if you'd made a mistake leaving the warmth of a crowded apartment for the eerie isolation of an old building. I had just finished reading a book in my favorite recliner when a noise, so subtle at first that I almost dismissed it, caught my attention. It sounded like soft footsteps echoing down the hall. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the house was settling, or maybe the wind had pushed a loose shutter. But as the sound continued, slow, deliberate, and impossibly measured, I couldn't ignore it. I sat motionless, straining to hear any further detail. The sound came again, a gentle, rhythmic thud, followed by another, then the faintest whisper of a creak. I pressed my hand against my chest as a cold dread began to coil in my gut. I recalled the countless nights of silence that had made this house my sanctuary, and now it was as if the quiet had been invaded by a presence I couldn't quite name. Steeling myself, I rose from my chair and crept toward the hallway. I kept my hand on the wall, letting the cold, rough texture ground me as I advanced. Each step was an act of will, a defiance of the growing terror that screamed at me to run. The hallway stretched long and narrow before me, lined with faded wallpaper and pictures of people I'd never met, the previous occupants whose lives were interred in this aged space. With each measured step I took, the sound of the footsteps grew a little louder, as if echoing my own anxiety. As I reached the middle of the hall, I paused. The soft footsteps had halted right outside a closed door at the far end, a door I hadn't paid much attention to since moving in. It was an unassuming door with peeling paint and a tarnished knob that rattled slightly whenever the wind caught it. But tonight, it stood out in a way that pricked my every instinct. Something was behind it, something that didn't belong to the familiar creaks of an old house settling into winter. I blinked, wondering if my eyes were deceiving me in the dark. The house was supposed to be empty, and yet, the sound, those footsteps, had a deliberate rhythm that no natural creak could imitate. I squinted at the door, trying to catch any sign of movement through the narrow crack at the bottom. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then came another sound, a slow, deliberate thump, as if a heavy object had been set down gently on the floor. My heart began to hammer in my chest, urging me to retreat even as curiosity burrowed into my mind. "Hello?" I whispered, the word trembling as it escaped my lips. I expected an answer, even a slurred, ghostly echo. But the only response was a deep, resonant silence. Yet the silence was not empty. In it, I could almost hear the anticipation, a breath held in waiting, a secret that longed to be told. Not entirely satisfied with my unanswered plea, I took a step closer to the door, running my fingers along the faded brass knob as though it could transfer some warmth or reassurance. The metal was icy in my grip, and for a fleeting moment, I was certain I wasn't alone. In the stillness, the sound of my own heartbeat was deafening, each pulse echoing in the cavernous silence of the corridor. With a final, determined breath, I turned the knob slowly, half expecting it to creak open on its own. The door swung open with a long, mournful groan that sent shivers down my spine. Beyond was a narrow passageway that I had never noticed before, one that branched off from the main corridor and led into a part of the house shrouded in perpetual dusk. A thread of moonlight spilled in from a distant window at the end of the passage, illuminating only the edges of the room. I hesitated at its threshold, wondering if it would be better to ignore the summons altogether, but something compelled me forward. It was as if the footsteps had been guiding me here all along. I stepped into the passage, and the door closed silently behind me. In the low light, I realized that the walls here were different from those in the main corridor. They were adorned with old wallpaper and patterns that seemed strangely familiar, patterns I had seen in an old family album, perhaps belonging to one of the many lives this house had sheltered. Dust danced in the air, illuminated by the weak light, and every step stirred up memories of long-forgotten secrets. As I advanced slowly, my eyes caught the slightest movement at the edge of the light, a shadow perhaps, that darted behind a rickety wooden door. My pulse quickened, and I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding so fiercely I was sure it might burst. I strained to listen for any indication of another presence. Instead, I heard only the soft echo of my own breath and the residual patter of footsteps that had led me this far. I crept forward until I reached a small room at the end of the passage. The door, slightly ajar, beckoned me to peer inside. I pushed it open with trembling fingers, and what I saw made me freeze in place. The room was a forgotten relic, a narrow, cramped space that resembled a storage area, or maybe a forgotten study. In the center stood an old wooden chair, its upholstery torn and faded. Scattered around, there were dusty books, faded photographs in ornate frames, and peculiar trinkets whose origins I couldn't decipher. But what caught my attention was a set of fresh footprints on the otherwise thick layer of dust. They were small, almost childlike, but unmistakably human. The footprints started at the door and led toward the far corner of the room, vanishing as if swallowed by shadows. My mind raced with questions. Who had left these footprints? Was it possible that someone else had been here this very night? I had been so careful, locking doors, checking the windows, ensuring that I was alone in this house. And yet, here were these undeniable marks of another presence. I crouched down, tracing the footprints with the tip of my finger. They were fresh, as if the person had been here only minutes ago. A chill spread through me, and I realized that I might not be the sole custodian of this house's secrets after all. I rose slowly, a mixture of dread and determination coursing through me. I could no longer ignore the sounds I had heard for weeks, the footsteps echoing in the hall, the mysterious thuds, and now the traces of someone unseen. Every whisper of sound in this corridor, every faint movement of the shadows seemed to coalesce into a single, haunting truth. I was not alone. I gathered my courage and decided to follow the trail of footprints. At first, the path was clear. They led directly from the small room back into the corridor, toward an area of the house I rarely visited. A narrow hallway that connected the living spaces to a series of closed rooms at the rear. The hallway was even more oppressive than the rest of the house, its walls marked with the remnants of old, scorched wallpaper and the persistent odor of decay that no open window could dispel. The footprints continued, this time appearing more erratic, almost frantic, as if the person had been running, desperate to escape or perhaps to hide from something. As I advanced down the hall, my mind began to conjure up images of horror movies I'd watched in my youth, images of children fleeing unseen terrors in abandoned houses, of spectral figures chasing after the living through dim corridors. The sound of the footsteps was growing louder here, clearer even, and I could swear I heard faint panting mixed in with them. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, yet an inexplicable curiosity bound my feet to the floor. I passed closed doors whose numbers I didn't remember from a standard house layout. Some were oddly labeled with faded symbols rather than numbers. The further I walked, the more I felt the oppressive weight of the house history pressing in on me. It was as though the walls themselves were imbued with the grief and terror of those who had once inhabited the spaces I now traversed. Then, as I reached the very end of the hallway, I noticed that the door at the far end was slightly ajar. A dim, flickering light spilled out from the gap, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps, a staccato rhythm that made my skin crawl. I realized with a jolt that the footprints had led me directly here. With hands clenched in trepidation, I approached the door and peered inside. The room beyond was small, almost like a makeshift playroom, but with an atmosphere of profound neglect. In the center of the floor was an old, ornate rug that had once been vibrant with pattern, but was now faded and torn. Near the rug stood a low table cluttered with dusty toys, a porcelain doll with cracked eyes, a set of worn-out crayons, and a framed photograph of a little girl whose smile had long since faded into melancholy. The presence here was palpable. The air felt heavy, as if every lingering regret and every sorrowful memory of the past had accumulated in this very space. I felt a pressure building in my chest. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to unlock a secret that had been hidden for decades. In the far corner, I noticed a small, door-like recess built into the wall. It was nearly concealed by cobwebs and a tattered curtain, but I could see fresh scuff marks on its surface, evidence that someone had recently used it, perhaps in haste. Drawn by a mixture of terror and empathy, I moved closer. My footsteps were soft on the creaking wooden floor as I approached the recess. There was something disturbingly intimate about the marks here, as if someone had been hiding and then suddenly fled in a moment of sheer panic. I reached out and slowly pulled aside the curtain, its fabric soft and threadbare in my trembling hands. Behind it was a narrow doorway leading into a dark, almost suffocating space. I could make out the outline of another passage, one that was not accessible from the main parts of the house. This, I realized, was a secret section, a place the previous occupants had hidden away, perhaps for reasons I could no longer fathom. I hesitated, heart beating erratically, before gathering the resolve to step inside. The air grew colder as I passed through the doorway, and the sound of my own footsteps was muffled by layers of dust and silence. I reached the end of the passage and found myself in a tiny chamber filled with relics of a bygone era. Yellowed letters tied with brittle string, a rusted music box that still managed to produce a faint, melancholic tune when wound, and several faded portraits of individuals who looked as if they had once known unfathomable sorrow. One portrait in particular caught my eye, a woman with eyes that seemed to plead for salvation, her delicate features framed by curls that cascaded like an echo of lost time. On the back of the frame was a date, 1947. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this her? Had she been the one who once walked these halls, leaving footprints that I now followed? The intensity of the moment overwhelmed me, and I nearly collapsed under the weight of the unanswered questions and the haunting beauty of sorrow captured in faded paint. I sat down on a dusty, cold bench in the chamber and listened. The silence here was different. It was heavier, laden with unsaid words and broken promises. In the distance, I could faintly hear a soft murmur, like a voice reading a lullaby from another world. It wasn't a direct conversation, but a series of overlapping whispers, as if multiple souls were trying to share their stories all at once. I couldn't decipher the words, but I caught fragments: lost, forgotten, alone, and please remember. The realization struck me with a mix of horror and compassion. I was witnessing the echo of a profound, unspoken tragedy. The footsteps in the hall, the secret passageways, the hidden chamber, they all formed parts of a vast tapestry of sorrow and neglect. I began to understand that the house was not merely an empty shell, but rather a vessel containing the lingering presences of those who had suffered within its walls. Their traces were embedded in every scuff on the floor, every whisper of sound in the dark, every faded portrait left behind. I rose from the bench, determined to piece together this fragmented history. Clutching one of the yellowed letters in my hand, I tried to read the delicate, spidery handwriting. The letter spoke of heartbreak, of a promise to return that was never fulfilled. It hinted at secrets too dangerous to mention aloud. It mentioned a name repeatedly, Evelyn, and described a night full of regrets and unfinished farewells. I could barely make out the crumbling ink as I read, but the message was clear. Evelyn had been a soul lost in time, yearning for acknowledgement long after she had departed. The realization that I was not just being haunted, but was given a duty to remember those who had been forgotten settled over me like a mantle of bittersweet responsibility. The footsteps, that constant, deliberate cadence echoing in the halls of my home, were not meant to frighten me into isolation. They were a call to remember, a plea for resolution, and a testament to the power of memory. A sudden crash in the distance jolted me from my reverie. I startled and clutched the letter tightly to my chest, my eyes darting to the far end of the passage where darkness swallowed every detail. The sound was unmistakable, a heavy, echoing thud, as if something had been dropped or deliberately set in motion. I couldn't tell if it was a sign of danger or a clue to further unravel this mystery. Hesitantly, I moved toward the direction of the noise. As I stepped back into the narrow corridor, the old wooden floor groaned under my weight. Every step seemed punctuated by a new, disembodied sound, a shuffle of feet, the creak of old hinges, and even, at times, the subtle sigh of air moving through unseen cracks. I followed the path of these clues until I reached a long-forgotten part of the hallway that I hadn't explored before. There, the sound of footsteps was unmistakable, soft at first, then faster, almost hurried. They thumped along a worn-out carpet, echoing against walls decorated with peeling, ghostly wallpaper. I froze. The footsteps had become erratic, as if their owner was trying to escape or hide. In that moment, the silence of the house was shattered by a sudden, sharp cry, a sound that resonated not only in the halls but deep within me. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or a real voice, but it had the quality of anguish, of calling out in desperation. Unable to ignore it, I pressed on, following the trail deeper into the labyrinth of dark corridors. At last, I arrived at a heavy, creaking door marked with a single, weathered number I didn't recognize. It was locked, but there were fresh scratches along its surface, evidence of someone or something desperately trying to force it open from the inside. With trembling fingers, I found an old key on a hook nearby, a key that should not have worked in this modern lock, yet somehow it fit. I inserted it slowly, every click of the tumblers echoing like a countdown. The door swung open with an eerie moan, revealing a spacious room that seemed to defy the rest of the building's decay. Here, a grand hallway stretched out, lined with mirrors that reflected not only my pale, terrified face, but also fleeting images of people who were not there. For a split second, I saw a little girl in a frilly dress, her eyes wide with fear, and a man with sorrow etched into his features, silently pleading. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only a lingering chill. I stepped inside cautiously. The hall was decorated with remnants of past glories. An elegant chandelier that hung precariously from a high ceiling, portraits in gilded frames whose subjects seemed almost to watch my every move, and a thick red carpet that muffled the sound of my footsteps. Yet the most disturbing element was the sound, a series of gentle, measured footsteps that ran alongside mine, as though I were being followed by a silent companion. I reached out to touch one of the mirrors and saw not just my reflection, but the ghostly afterimage of a pair of feet following me behind. The reflection was slow, deliberate, a contrast to my hurried, trembling steps. I gasped and spun around, only to find the corridor empty. My pulse thundered as I realized I was caught in a disorienting interplay between past and present, memory and current terror. The atmosphere in the hall was suffocating, and every breath I took seemed to carry with it a whisper of the lives that had been lost here. I could almost hear fragments of conversation, of arguments and sobbing, as if the very walls were speaking of old tragedies and unfinished business. One particular murmur, a sorrowful cadence, repeated in my ears. Come back. Remember me. It was both a plea and an accusation, a demand that someone, anyone, acknowledge the forgotten souls whose stories were etched into the fabric of this place. I sank to my knees in the center of the hall, overwhelmed by the relentless procession of voices and footsteps that haunted me. The mansion seemed to breathe, its ancient heartbeat resonating in time with mine. I clutched the letter about Evelyn and let tears of both fear and compassion roll down my cheeks. I knew now that the footsteps through the hall were not malignant forces. They were the echoes of lives interrupted, of tragedies that had never been properly mourned. They were a call for remembrance, a desperate bid for closure that I alone was now burdened to answer. Determined not to let these restless echoes fade into the silence once more, I vowed to uncover the stories behind each faded footprint and whispered call. I began scouring the corridors for any scrap of evidence, old diaries, family records, news clippings stuck behind peeling wallpaper. Each discovery deepened the mystery and my connection to this house's tragic past. I found, for example, a brittle newspaper article from 1947 recounting the mysterious disappearance of a young woman named Evelyn, whose beauty and sorrow had captivated those around her until her abrupt vanishing. The article mentioned rumors of betrayal, of a scandal so shattering that her family had concealed everything, even going so far as to erase her memory from public records. As dawn began to edge its way into the hall, casting long, grim shadows across the floor, the echoing footsteps finally subsided. The house, heavy with its secrets, seemed to exhale, a long-held breath released slowly into the chilly morning air. I was left with more questions than answers, but I had learned that the very walls of this home carried the voices of those who needed to be remembered. I now live in a new place, far from that haunted townhouse. But on quiet, stormy nights, I sometimes lie awake wondering if I have truly left the echoes behind. I can still hear those gentle, deliberate footsteps in my mind, the steady, sorrowful cadence that once led me down long, dark corridors in search of lost souls. I carry with me the memory of Evelyn and the countless others whose tragedies whispered through the hall. Their voices remind me that every space, every home, holds stories that insist on being remembered, that even in absolute solitude, the past is never truly gone. I have written down every scrap of evidence, every note and photograph I managed to salvage. I have shared their stories in forums and local history groups, urging others to remember them too. For in the act of remembrance, the cold grip of abandonment loosens, and even the most lonely corridor can become a place of healing and tribute. So if you ever find yourself in an old house, alone in the silence of night, listen carefully to the sounds that echo through the hall. Not every step is meant to instill fear. Some are a plea for remembrance, a call to honor those long past. And when you hear those footsteps, take a moment to pause, to remember. For each echo is a reminder that even in solitude, we are never truly alone. Footsteps through the hall is my account of a night when the past reached out through the darkness, a reminder that every home, no matter how empty it might seem, is haunted by the echoes of lives once lived. I now know that the footsteps were not a threat, but a chorus of lost souls, each urging me, and perhaps you, to remember. It began on an ordinary, rain-soaked night when I finally decided to claim the old house I had long dreamed of owning. I'd passed over many modern apartments and brand new townhouses, but something about the faded wood, the creaking floors, and the storied past of this aging structure beckoned me. I knew from the very first visit that the house held secrets behind every locked door and dusty corner. I wasn't sure what those secrets might be, but the feeling that I was meant to uncover them was irresistible. The day I moved in was a blur of unpacking boxes, organizing old heirlooms left behind by the previous owners, and silent, almost reverent exploration. The house was a sprawling, two-story building with a peculiar layout, a narrow staircase that descended beneath the main floor to a basement I had scarcely noticed. I asked the realtor about it, and he merely shrugged, saying, "It's been empty as long as anyone can remember." I never thought much about it at the time. That first night, after I had set up a modest dinner at my reclaimed dining table and settled in with a book and a cup of lukewarm tea, I began to hear a sound that made me freeze in my armchair. It was faint at first, a soft, persistent creak that seemed to echo from below. I told myself it was just the old house settling in the cool night air. The rain pattered against the window, and all seemed calm. Yet, as the hours of darkness deepened, the sound grew unmistakably deliberate. A slow, measured thump, as if heavy footsteps were pacing down the hallway of the basement. At 2:13 a.m., I was finally roused from a restless sleep by the unmistakable groan of the house. I lay there in the silence for what seemed like an eternity before bolting upright. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. That sound, an uneven, shuffling noise, seemed to be coming from the floor below. I remembered the narrow staircase tucked away in a dark corner of the living room, its entrance partly hidden by a threadbare rug. Though I had ignored it at move-in, I now realized that the basement must hold more than just storage. Perhaps it was where the history of this house was kept hidden, locked away from prying eyes. I rose, heart in my throat, and made my way over to the stairs. Every step creaked and moaned beneath my weight, each sound amplifying the lurking dread that I couldn't dispel. With the beam of my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand, I descended into the darkness. The air was cold and musty, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and inexplicable. The narrow staircase led me downward in a slow spiral until I finally reached the basement door. Before I could push it open, I hesitated, swallowed hard, and listened. There it was again, the sound of footsteps, irregular and heavy, echoing like the measured pacing of an unseen presence. I pressed my ear against the cold, warped wood of the door, my skin prickling as I strained to catch even the faintest detail. There was silence on the other side now, yet I knew better than to trust that silence. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned the rusty knob and slowly eased the door open. A weak shaft of light revealed a sprawling space that stretched into shadows, far larger than I'd imagined. The basement was cluttered with remnants of a forgotten era, old furniture draped in tattered sheets, stacks of dusty crates, and cobwebs glistening in the faint glow of my phone's light. In one corner, against a sagging wall, stood a large armoire draped in dark cloth. The atmosphere pressed in on me as I stepped inside. Every breath felt labored, as though I were inhaling the very grief and regret that had seeped into these walls over countless years. I wandered slowly among the relics, noticing details that made my skin crawl. Faded photographs in sepia tones that captured families long gone, letters and documents with dates that stretched back nearly 100 years, and odd trinkets whose purpose I could not decipher. I began to wonder if these items were deliberately arranged as if to tell a story, a message left by those who had once inhabited this space. In the midst of exploring, I stumbled upon something far more disturbing. A set of fresh muddy footprints leading from the heavy armoire toward a narrow doorway in the far wall. The print was unmistakably human, though the ground in this long abandoned basement had been undisturbed for decades. And yet, here were these footprints, small, erratic, like those of a child, fresh in a place that should have been long forgotten. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been living here in secret? Had a lost child once wandered these corridors and been trapped? I couldn't decide whether the footprints were evidence of a sleeping presence or the result of my own overactive imagination. Despite my horror, I felt an irresistible urge to follow the trail. With cautious steps, I advanced deeper into the basement, following the trail as it curved around old workbenches and piles of discarded newspapers. Every so often, I would stop, heart pounding, to listen for any sound that might confirm my worst fears. The passageway led me to a narrow hall lined with ancient, cracked stone walls. A few rusted light fixtures hung precariously above, casting weak, uneven illumination across a series of closed, wooden doors. The footprints stopped abruptly at one of the doors, a heavy door with peeling paint and a large, ornate knocker molded in the shape of a snarling beast. I pushed my fingers against the door, feeling the chill of the surface. For a moment, I considered retreating, wondering if I'd inadvertently disturbed something I was never meant to uncover. But something deep inside, perhaps a mixture of morbid curiosity and an inexplicable sense of duty, forced me to continue. I slowly opened the door, half expecting it to creak in protest. Inside was a small, private room that looked entirely out of place. Instead of the musty, cluttered chaos of the rest of the basement, this room was organized almost as if it were a study from a bygone era. A large desk dominated the space, its surface covered with yellow papers, faded photographs, and an assortment of old, leather-bound books. The walls were lined with shelves that held delicate porcelain figurines and antique trinkets. In the center of the room, perched on a pedestal, was a large mirror framed in elaborate, dark wood. For a moment, its presence startled me. Why would this mirror, so pristine compared to the decay around it, be preserved in this secret chamber? As I stepped inside, the door closed behind me with a definitive click, echoing like a final sentence in an old, tragic story. My eyes were immediately drawn to the desk. A journal lay open, its pages scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. I approached slowly and began to read. The journal detailed the recollections of someone who had lived in the house long ago, a person whose words bled with sorrow and regret. The entry spoke of a terrible family secret, of a daughter taken too soon, of a promise broken by the cruelty of fate. The author wrote of a hidden room where she had concealed evidence of the tragedy, and of a mirror that was said to hold the soul of the lost child. I felt a chill that wasn't entirely due to the cold. The entries mentioned the child's name, Lillian, and described how, in the later years, the mirror would sometimes show a faint image of her sorrowful face when the author's anguish became too great to bear. At that moment, I understood that I had stumbled upon the basement's secret, a hidden chapter of the house history that had been deliberately locked away, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. The footprints, the secret passageways, and even the locked door, all of it made sense now. The author of the journal had been a desperate soul, trying to preserve the memory of her only child, Lillian, whose life had been snuffed out by a series of misfortunes and unspoken family rivalries. The mirror, preserved in that private room, was said to be the final connection between the living and the dead, a portal for the child's spirit to remain tethered to this world. I sat down at the desk, overwhelmed by a mix of sorrow and terror. My own heart ached as I read about a life filled with loss and guilt, the desperate longing of a mother to see her child one last time. Every word in the journal carried an emotional weight that made the air in the secret study feel nearly unbearable. I could almost hear the muffled cries of a broken family echoing softly through the silence. Outside the room, footsteps began to stir once again, this time gentler, as if in cautious warning rather than threat. The sound was deliberate, measured, and filled with a strange sort of sorrow. Unable to resist the pull of the unknown, I rose from the desk and moved toward the mirror. Its surface was flawless and dark, reflecting not just my own terrified face, but also a superimposed image that chilled me to the bone. For just an instant, I saw a small figure, a little girl in a pale dress with tear-stained sheets, standing behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the room was empty save for the heavy silence and the ghost of grief that permeated every corner. I turned back to the mirror, only to see the figure again. The girl's eyes met mine with a desperate pleading, as though trying to communicate a message that transcended the barrier between the living and the dead. It was in that moment that I began to suspect that the footprints I had followed were not made by someone still alive, but rather by a spectral remnant, a child whose small feet had once padded innocently across these floors. Perhaps Lillian's spirit had roamed these corridors searching for the love and recognition that had been denied to her in life. The journal's final entry had ended abruptly, the ink nearly smeared by tears. If anyone finds this, know that I have lost everything. Lillian, my darling, I cannot keep you hidden forever. I beg you to be remembered. That plea reverberated in my mind as I stared into the mirror. For hours, I sat in that secret study, the storm outside intensifying as if echoing the tumult within me. I resolved then that I could not let this tragic story fade into oblivion. I gathered the journal, a few of the fragile photographs, and copies of the old newspaper clippings I had found scattered in the basement. With shaking hands, I documented every detail, determined to piece together the full truth of what had transpired in this accursed house. I made several trips between the secret study and the main areas of the basement, searching for additional clues, hidden compartments in the walls, engraved initials on ancient beams, faded handprints on long-forgotten artifacts. Each discovery pulled me deeper into the sorrowful tale of Lillian and the mother who had tried in vain to preserve her memory. The basement itself seemed to transform during my investigation. Shadows lengthened and shifted in a way that suggested the lingering presence of old sorrows. It was as if the very walls exhaled memories of heartbreak and remorse, and the ambient noises, dripping water, creaking floors, the soft hum of a long-dead air conditioner, blended with whispers of the past. I found myself speaking aloud, asking questions into the darkness, hoping that somewhere amid the echoes I would hear the answer. Lillian, can you hear me? I'd call softly, and sometimes for a heartbeat, I felt that the air vibrated with a response, a faint, indistinct murmur that might have been a sigh or perhaps a plea. Weeks merged into one another as I dedicated myself to unraveling the basement secret. Each night, after ensuring the house was locked tight, I would descend into that labyrinth of sorrow with my camera and notebook, retracing the footsteps etched into the dust. I began to record the eerie sounds and capture images that defied conventional explanation. Flickering lights in abandoned corners, a child's laughter echoing faintly, though no living soul should be present, even moments when the mirror in the secret study reflected not my own face, but that of a small, weeping child. Sometimes I would find new sets of muddy footprints leading away from the study into even darker recesses that I had never seen before. I followed those trails with a mix of dread and determination, too afraid to look back yet compelled to uncover every hidden part of the tragic tapestry that clung to this house. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls and the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, I uncovered a final piece of evidence. In a cramped, neglected storage room off the main basement corridor, I discovered a trunk partially hidden beneath a faded tarpaulin. Inside lay a collection of personal belongings, a small, worn teddy bear, a lock of hair sealed in a faded envelope, and a delicate silver locket engraved with the initials R. My hands trembled as I opened the locket, and inside was a tiny, sepia-toned photograph of a little girl whose sad eyes looked eerily like the apparition I had seen. This confirmation shattered any remaining hope that the haunting was but my imagination. I was in the grip of something far more real than I could have ever believed, a curse of memory and mourning that had persisted in the silence of these walls. I spent the following days compiling every scrap of documentation, every photograph, every handwritten note. I reached out to local historians and scoured old records to understand the tragic fate of Lillian and her family. I learned that the house had once belonged to a prominent family whose reputation was marred by scandal and loss. Lillian, it turned out, had been a bright, gentle child caught in the crossfire of family secrets and a bitter feud that led to a series of misfortunes culminating in a mysterious fire. The tragedy was hushed up, the memories deliberately obscured by those who wished to forget. And now, her spirit, along with that of her grieving mother, seemed to haunt the basement, the last bastion of their shattered past. With time, I began to feel that my role in this unfolding drama was not that of a mere intruder, but of a reluctant chronicler, a person entrusted with the responsibility to remember and bear witness. I created an extensive archive, digitizing photographs, transcribing every journal entry, and even publishing fragments of the story on local forums, urging anyone who might have even the faintest recollection of Lillian to come forward. The response was both heart-wrenching and bizarre. Some recounted long-forgotten family stories. Others whispered that they'd heard similar sounds in their own homes. I became a repository for the collective grief of a past generation desperate to be seen. Yet even as I documented her tragic history, the supernatural events in the basement grew more insistent. At night, I would lie awake, my eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, listening to the rhythmic thumping of footsteps and distant voices. There were moments when I could feel a cold hand brush against mine as I walked past the closed storage rooms, or when a child's giggle echoed softly, only to vanish like a mirage. The presence in the basement was not malevolent. There was a deep, overwhelming sadness in its echoes, but it was insistent, a constant reminder of a wound that had never healed. One evening, after an exhausting day of investigation and record-keeping, I returned to the secret study to find it transformed. The mirror, which had previously held only fleeting images of a weeping child, now burned with a steady, ghostly light. In its reflection, I saw not myself, but a full, sorrowful apparition, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face etched with grief and resignation. She appeared to be silently pleading with me, her eyes silently demanding that the truth of her loss be acknowledged. For what seemed like hours, I stood there transfixed, unable to tear my gaze away from the haunting image. In that moment, I finally understood that the basement's secret was not simply a series of random hauntings. It was a call to remember, to honor the legacy of pain and tragedy that had been walled away for far too long. I gathered my courage and addressed the apparition aloud. I will remember you. I promise I will not let your story fade into oblivion. Whether it was my words or the raw emotion behind them, the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a bittersweet relief. The apparition slowly faded, leaving behind only the soft glow of the mirror and the quiet thud of my own heartbeat. I knew that the process of healing would be long and agonizing, but at least, for now, I had done my part to break the silence. Even now, as I live in a new home and try to bury the memories of that haunted basement beneath layers of routine and modernity, I often hear the echo of those footsteps late at night. I preserve the journal and photographs in a safe place and continue to share Lillian's story with anyone willing to listen. The basement's secret is now a part of me, a reminder that the past never truly dies, and that every house, every relic, can harbor stories too painful to forget. I have learned that facing the ghosts of our history, however tragic and unsettling, is the only way to bring some measure of light into the darkness. In the echoing corridors of that basement, I found not just horror, but the profound, aching beauty of memory, loss, and ultimately, redemption. And so, whenever I hear a stray noise or catch a glimpse of a shadow in a quiet room, I pause, remember, and honor those who came before me, lest their secrets be lost in the silence forever. The basement's secret is my chronicle of a journey deep into the heart of a house haunted by grief, where every creak and dusty footprint speaks of lives once lived and lost. In uncovering its hidden sorrow, I found the courage to confront my own isolation and the importance of remembering the past. May this story serve as a reminder that even in our darkest, most forgotten corners, the echoes of our history call out, waiting to be heard. I never imagined that a place dedicated to history and art could harbor such unspeakable horrors. Yet, that is exactly what I found on my second night as a night guard at the Marlow Historical Museum, a sprawling institution housed in an imposing neoclassical building with aging stone walls, soaring ceilings, and halls that wind like a labyrinth of memories. What I witnessed that night defies explanation, and the horror of what I encountered still haunts my every waking moment. It all began like any other shift on a brisk November evening. I had returned to the museum for a second job after losing my previous position in a less reputable security firm. The museum staff assured me that it was merely an institution of art and antiquities, where nothing more supernatural than the occasional dripping water or creaking floorboards occurred. I believed them then, despite my own uneasy gut feeling that suggested something was very, very wrong beneath the polished facade. That night, my tasks were standard: secure the exhibits, monitor the halls, and ensure that all the doors remained locked. However, the museum's layout was different on the historical wing, an area rarely visited by the public. This wing held collections that chronicled local legends, lost civilizations, and mysterious relics with origins that spanned centuries. Rumor had it that some artifacts here carried curses or were linked to tragic pasts, but these were dismissed as tall tales by most. I, however, felt a sense of foreboding every time I passed its heavy oak doors with brass plaques engraved with archaic symbols. At exactly 10:30 p.m., I set out for my first round. I passed through the grand entrance hall, its crystal chandeliers casting quivering reflections onto the polished marble floor. Portraits of long-dead benefactors and founders lined the walls, their eyes seemingly following me as I walked. I muttered a half-hearted greeting to one particularly stern-faced man in a faded waistcoat, but he offered no response, only the unchanging, cold stare of a painted remnant of history. The first exhibit I reached was the Hall of Lost Voices, a collection dedicated to objects said to capture the whispers of those who once lived. Artifacts here included an antique phonograph rumored to record echoes of past conversations, a cracked mirror that many believed showed the face of a deceased relative, and an ancient, ornate key said to unlock memories of long-forgotten souls. I paused at the phonograph display, unable to explain why the air around it felt charged, as if saturated with a secret energy. The brass horn of the machine shone eerily in the dim light, even though it hadn't been turned on in decades. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere in the distance. I checked my watch. It was 10:35 p.m. Assuming it was merely a power adjustment or the building settling, I continued my rounds. I rounded a corner and entered a narrow corridor lined with sealed glass cases containing artifacts of dubious provenance. A rusted, ancient dagger, a set of ceramic figurines with eyes that seemed too lifelike, and a faded tapestry embroidered with symbols I couldn't decipher. The corridor's lighting was unusually dim here, and as I stepped closer to a display of carved stone relics from a remote temple, I noticed that the air grew inexplicably cold. I could see my breath in the pale light, and my skin prickled with an involuntary shudder. Then I heard it, a single, breathy whisper. My heart thumped in my chest as I froze. The whisper was almost imperceptible, as if someone near my ear was saying, "Help me." I spun around, half expecting to see a person, but there was only the empty corridor and the incessant hum of the ancient fluorescent lights above. My rational mind insisted it was my imagination, triggered by the oppressive atmosphere of the museum and the endless hours of solitude. I took a shaky breath and resumed my inspection. A sign on the wall pointed me toward the private archives, a small set of locked rooms at the far end of the wing. This archive was off limits to visitors and meant for the inner circle of museum staff and curators only. Tonight, however, a malfunction in the security system had left the door ajar. I hesitated for only a moment before pulling it open. The air behind the door was heavy, thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and something else. I could not quite place it. It smelled faintly metallic and oddly sweet like decaying flowers. Inside the archive, boxes and filing cabinets were arranged meticulously. Among them, I spotted an antique leather-bound journal with its cover embossed in faded gold. Curiosity compelled me to pick it up. It was Harold Marlowe's personal diary, the founder of the museum. a man reputed for his obsession with esoteric knowledge, curses, and the unexplainable. I had heard rumors about his strange experiments and cryptic writings, but reading his first-hand account was something else entirely. The diary detailed late-night experiments, occult rituals performed in secret within the museum's sub-basement, and strange occurrences witnessed by Harold himself. One entry sent shivers down my spine. Dated October 31st, 1978, it read, "Tonight, the veil thins. The voices of those long-lost call from beyond. I must pay heed to their silent cries, for they demand release. The relics speak, if one dares listen." As I flipped through subsequent pages, scribbles in shaky handwriting described events that defied logic, a spectral procession seen in the halls, disembodied figures wandering the corridors, and a ritual in the museum's crypt that ended with a bloodstain on an ancient stone altar bearing a single word, release. I set the journal down with trembling fingers as a sudden noise startled me. It was a deep, resonant thump, like the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in a cavern. The noise came from behind a thick velvet curtain that separated the archive from a small storeroom. With rational caution at war with a primal fear, I walked toward the curtain and pulled it aside. What I saw was a small room that I'd never noticed before. Its walls were lined with tattered posters from long discontinued exhibitions and dominated by a large, dusty mirror. The mirror itself was ornate, framed in carved oak with intricate patterns reminiscent of ancient runes. As I stared into the mirror, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of light, a shape passing behind me, only for the reflection to settle back into normalcy. I rubbed my eyes and backed away. The sound of the footsteps seemed to grow louder, now joined by faint, echoing whispers that sounded just beyond human comprehension. I felt a cold hand of dread grip my heart. Determined to maintain control, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back into the main corridor, leaving the secret room behind. I resumed my rounds, but every shadow and every unexpected sound now seemed loaded with menace. I passed through the gallery of timeless faces, where portraits and sculptures of historical figures appeared almost lifelike in the flickering light. As I approached a particularly somber sculpture of a long-forgotten monarch, I noticed that the eyes of the stone figure had a subtle gleam, as though tears, or something like them, were welling up. I froze for a moment, feeling that the statue was mourning, before its expression hardened back into its carved stoicism. It wasn't long before I noticed that the museum wasn't as empty as it should be. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, measured, followed my own. I stopped dead in a hallway lined with ancient tapestries depicting battles and legends. The footsteps paused, then resumed, always just out of sight. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My echo was the only answer I received. The sense of being followed grew overwhelming. I turned quickly, but saw only the endless, dusty corridor. The lights overhead buzzed and hummed, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a pale face reflected in the glass of a display cabinet before it vanished. I ducked into a side room, locking the door behind me. In that room were the museum's minor treasures, a collection of coins from lost civilizations, and a series of ivory carvings that depicted mythical creatures. I sat on a worn bench and tried to calm my racing heart. My mind raced through the diary's passages and the strange events of the night. Had I awakened something that had been sleeping here for decades? Perhaps the museum was not simply filled with relics of the past, but with echoes of the old, dark magic that Harold Marlowe had dabbled in. I remembered his repeated insistence about release and wondered if the footsteps I heard were not human at all, but those of an entity bound to the artifacts, waiting for its chance to slip free from its ancient chains. With little choice but to confront whatever was pursuing me, I gathered my nerve and cautiously opened the door. The corridor was in shadow, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning from an approaching storm outside. The air had grown thick, as though time itself had slowed. I crept down the hall, every nerve alert to the rustle of fabric or the whisper of voices. The flickering lights played tricks on my eyes. For one dreadful moment, I saw the image of a small girl in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow and pleading, standing in the middle of the corridor. I blinked and she was gone. I reached what I believed was the exit door to the main hall. My hands shook as I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door felt as if it had grown heavy with the weight of years and something else, something intangible and malevolent. I pounded on it, calling out for help, but the silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire building was swallowing my cries. With no other option, I slipped through a side door and found myself in a dim corridor I had never seen before, one that twisted and curved unnaturally, with walls that seemed to pulse with an almost organic texture. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that felt like a cross between a museum atrium and a tomb. At its center, on a marble pedestal, was an enormous, intricately carved sarcophagus. The lid, decorated with strange symbols and figures of anguished faces, was slightly ajar. An icy draft escaped from the gap, carrying with it a faint sound like a chorus of sorrowful, distant cries. I approached the pedestal with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. As I reached out to touch the cold stone, the lid creaked loudly and swung fully open. Inside, instead of a mummy, lay a collection of aged photographs and personal belongings, a life once lived, now abandoned to time. Among the items was a single ornate locket, and when I picked it up, I felt an inexplicable weight settle on my soul. The locket was engraved with the initials HM, and its glass was cracked, reflecting my terrified face back at me. Suddenly, a series of disembodied voices erupted around me, overlapping and indistinct. They spoke in hushed tones, pleas, confessions, and accusations, and all at once, the chamber plunged into complete darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, activating it just in time to reveal that the pedestal was now surrounded by figures in tattered clothing, their eyes vacant yet filled with unspeakable sorrow. They reached out with skeletal hands, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were marionettes controlled by a malevolent puppeteer. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the whispers in my ears. One of the figures, an elderly man with a gaunt face and eyes that burned like coals, stepped forward and raised a hand in a trembling gesture that seemed both inviting and horrifying. His mouth opened in a silent scream, a soundless warning that chilled me to the core. In a burst of adrenaline-fueled terror, I turned and fled down the corridor. The voices trailed behind me, rising in intensity until they became a deafening cacophony of dread. I sprinted through twisting hallways that now resembled the inside of a living maze, where doors led to dead ends and windows revealed not the outside world, but other, darker corridors filled with shifting, spectral images. At every turn, I sensed unseen eyes watching, and I swore I felt icy fingers brush against my skin. After what felt like an eternity of running, I found myself back at the main atrium. The storm outside was raging, rain beating against the tall windows, and lightning illuminating the shadows that clung to the museum's walls. I collapsed onto a cold stone bench, gasping for breath, as I struggled to piece together what had happened. The entire museum seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm, as though it were a living entity, one that had awoken from a long slumber and was now hungering for release from the confines of its dark history. In the following days, I couldn't shake the memories of that night. I found myself drawn to research the history of the Marlowe Museum and its mysterious founder, Harold Marlowe. I discovered that Harold had been rumored to be involved in occult practices and that he had amassed many cursed relics over his lifetime. Old newspaper clippings spoke of unexplained phenomena within the museum's walls, of lights flickering in empty corridors and voices heard among the exhibits after closing time. There were even accounts from former staff members who, like me, had witnessed figures moving in the darkness. Yet none of these testimonies were ever taken seriously, dismissed as overactive imaginations or the result of isolation. I began to question whether I had merely imagined the terror of that night, or if I had truly glimpsed into something far more ancient and inexplicable. My dreams turned into vivid nightmares, endless corridors stretching into infinity, the sound of ghostly laughter echoing in the void, and that single, sorrowful gaze of the old man from the sarcophagus chamber. I woke up drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me home. One evening, unable to bear the torment any longer, I returned to the museum during the day, determined to confront the horror face to face. The museum was closed to the public, and a lone custodian meandered through the galleries as if in a daze. I managed to slip past him and entered the historical wing. The atmosphere was utterly different in daylight. Colors were more vibrant, and the oppressive feeling had lessened, replaced by a mundane sense of antiquity. Yet, as I approached the private archives once again, I felt a familiar coldness creeping over me. In a glass case on display was an old photograph of Harold Marlowe, his eyes intense and unnerving. In the background of the photo, barely visible, was a shadowed figure that looked disturbingly similar to the specter I had encountered that night. I stared at it for what seemed like hours, trying to decipher its form, until a sudden movement at the edge of my vision caused me to spin around. For a brief, horrifying moment, I saw a face contorted in pain and malice, and then it was gone. That image seared itself into my mind, a constant reminder of the curse that seemed to infect the very air of the museum. I left the building that afternoon with a heavy heart and a mind racing with unanswered questions. I knew I could no longer work there. The building had become a living nightmare that refused to let go of its dark secrets. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with the history of the museum and the possibility that Harold Marlowe's experiments had opened a door to something beyond our realm, a door that was never meant to be opened. I scoured archives, old newspapers, and online forums, piecing together accounts from other night guards, former employees, and even local residents who claimed that the museum was cursed. The more I read, the more I realized that I wasn't the first to encounter these horrors, and tragically, I might not be the last. One account, posted on a creepy horror forum, detailed the tragic fate of another security guard who had mysteriously vanished after working a night shift in the same museum decades ago. His friends reported hearing bizarre sounds coming from the museum long after he was gone, and later, when his belongings were found in a storage closet deep within the building, they were covered in an unexplainable layer of dust and dried blood. Other stories recounted the strange phenomenon of exhibits rearranging themselves overnight, the sound of footsteps echoing in empty corridors, and even visitors who claimed to have seen figures wandering among the relics during guided tours. I began to notice signs that the building itself might be alive, a pulsing beat echoing from the walls, the creaking floors that seemed to whisper in a language long forgotten. Some nights, I'd wake up to the sound of my own voice, softly repeating phrases I never knew I'd learned, as though the museum's dark legacy was imprinting itself upon my mind. I tried to resist, tried to forget what I had seen, but the memories were relentless. Now, I write this to warn anyone who might one day find themselves working in, or even visiting the Marlowe Historical Museum. What you witness within its walls may be more than a trick of the light or a figment of an overactive imagination. Some histories are buried so deep that disturbing them unleashes forces far beyond human control. The Museum of Forgotten Whispers is not a mere building filled with artifacts. It is a living repository of sorrow and terror, of unfulfilled cries from the past that claw their way back into the present. If you ever find yourself alone in a dimly lit museum, take heed of every whisper and shadow. Do not let curiosity lead you down dark corridors where time, memory, and fate converge into a twisted nightmare. I have seen the horrors that lie hidden behind the polished exhibits and revered relics, and I know with unyielding certainty that some secrets are best left unspoken. Even now, as I sit in a safe apartment far from that accursed place, I can still feel the museum's presence haunting me. In the dead of night, when the silence is almost suffocating, I sometimes hear faint echoes, disembodied voices reciting Harold Marlowe's desperate words from decades ago. I wonder if the museum's curse has taken root in my soul, doomed to follow me wherever I go. I urge you to be cautious with your own curiosity. What if the next time you find a door left ajar or a corridor that seems to twist into nothingness, you open it and release something that was never meant to leave its eternal prison? The relics may be silent, but the whispers they carry are anything but. I share my story not for fame or pity, but as a testament to the dangers that lurk in the forgotten corners of our past. The Marlowe Museum isn't just a collection of historical items, it's a mausoleum for memories that refuse to die, and every night it awaits the next unwary soul to cross its threshold and awaken the horrors within. Remember this: never trust a place where history seems to breathe, where echoes of the past become voices in the night. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and some whispers, once heard, will follow you forever. I write these words as both a confession and a caution. The Museum of Forgotten Whispers continues to haunt my every dream and shadow my every step. I pray that by recounting these horrifying events, I might spare someone else from the same fate and remind you all that some secrets of the past are best left in darkness. After the storm, I found him, a drenched stranger drifting in my pool. In that moment, I wished I'd never welcomed him inside my home. Even as a child, I was captivated by the strange gifts the sea brought ashore. Every summer at my Grammy's weathered beach house, a relic perched on the edge of the shore, I would wander barefoot around the water's edge. In Florida, the storms never ended. Each tempest brought a peculiar mix of debris and creatures that transformed our pool into a miniature ocean. I remember the thrill of discovering life among the broken branches and seaweed. Once, as I knelt at the water's edge with my dollar store net, a sudden ripple made me jump back. I expected a sea creature to emerge from the murk. Instead, it was only an old plank of wood. But then the water burst upward, drenching me, and for one fleeting moment, I believed I'd caught fish. That was when laughter echoed. Roman, the odd kid from next door with eyes too large and a perpetual smirk, had been watching. He was notorious for researching in Grammy's pool, though his true intentions were as murky as the water itself. Roman always prodding, always intruding. "What you looking for?" he'd say, his tone half mocking, half curious. I'd reply curtly, "Fish," and he'd tease that he too was on the hunt. I tried to shoo him away, but he never took no for an answer. His constant presence along the broken fence made it clear he'd heard more than I intended. Before I could shout for help, he slipped back into the water, another unwelcome shadow in my solitary quest. My searches yielded marvels: vibrant starfish, stray jellyfish from the tide, even a baby shark my mom had to rescue with a net. Yet nothing filled the void, the elusive secret both my Grammy and Roman whispered about: fish people. Grammy wasn't always the sharp, quirky storyteller I remembered. Diagnosed with a vicious form of Alzheimer's early on, she spent her later years locked in the haze of forgetfulness. But when her mind cleared, she spun tales of fantastical encounters beneath the waves. I clung to those stories like lifelines, desperate to preserve the memory of the woman I loved even as she slipped away. I recall my 10th birthday clearly. The power failed amid my favorite TV show, and while Grammy slept on the couch, I remembered Mom's storm preparedness. I gathered my flashlight, water bottles, snacks, and her medications, then helped her down to the basement. Usually quiet and distant by then, Grammy suddenly looked at me with a smile, a spark of her old self, and asked, "Can I tell you about the fish people, Charlotte?" I knew then that her stories were more than mere fables. They were echoes of a promise she once made. She told me of a beautiful boy from the sea, Sebastian, who had swept her away with dreams of a secret underwater kingdom. He asked me to be his queen. She'd laugh, recalling that day with a bittersweet glow. We were to run away together to a world beneath the waves. But as her tale turned darker, her voice wavered. She admitted that day after day, she waited on the shore, even as time and memory betrayed her. I waited until sunrise became sunset, she whispered, a confession of endless longing. Years later, as middle school dragged on, Roman's antics made me a laughingstock, nicknames and jeers that stung more than the ocean's salt. I clung to the fantasy of finding Sebastian, hoping that if I could rescue him for Grammy, maybe I could mend some of the shattered memories. I even began sending letters into the surf, believing that the sea might one day return her lost love. Then came the day when the past collided violently with the present. I received a terse text from Roman. "I'm not cleaning the pool." Apparently, as per an odd twist in Grammy's will, he was now a co-owner of the house, chosen because he resembled the mythical Sebastian. My parents were furious, but I had long since accepted that some ghosts of the past never truly fade away. That night, as a mild storm raged, I took refuge in the basement of the old house. Memories of Grammy's ceramic fish ornaments and the shells she claimed were gifts from Sebastian haunted me. Lost in thought, I nearly forgot the open gate until a sudden, frantic text shattered the silence. "Shut the gate." Idiot! I dashed outside into the howling wind, and that's when I saw it, a strange, ethereal movement beneath the dark surface of my pool. I dropped to my knees and grabbed my old net, eyes straining to follow a mysterious greenish glow beneath the water. Memories of childhood excitement mingled with dread as I waded into the pool. The water rippled, and then I saw him, a young man, early 20s, with a body half merged into something unearthly. His thick, tangled hair clung to his damp skin, interwoven with bits of driftwood and sea glass. When he emerged, his eyes met mine, a painful, silent plea amid blood streaks across the tiles. He bore an injury, a deep gash in what I now recognized as a fin that glimmered with the same shade as my own blood. I signaled him to wait and clumsily scrambled for my flashlight. Amid a wild gust of wind that nearly knocked me under, he pulled me to the surface. With trembling hands, I managed to drag him to Grammy's old bathtub, determined to tend to his wounds. As I bathed him, I recalled Grammy's whispered lore. Children of the sea must be soaked through, or they'll suffocate on land. I treated his bleeding scales with the care of someone trying to save a long-forgotten myth. But even as I asked if his name was Sebastian, he shook his head, clearly offended at my assumption. His silence, punctuated only by glances at my scattered shampoo bottles, deepened the mystery. For hours, we lay there, me recounting stories of Grammy's merman and him listening in silence. I marveled at how his skin shifted in the dim light, the transformation of flesh into scales reminiscent of a slow, creeping virus. His tail, too, was a marvel, a strange hybrid of fin and fused legs. At one point, just as I was losing myself in the fragile hope that he might be the same Sebastian of Grammy's memories, a violent pain gripped me. My lungs constricted, and I found myself gasping for air until the water itself became a savior. I managed to pull myself back to the pool's edge, where Roman reappeared, his eyes wide with alarm as he took in the surreal scene. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. Between choked breaths, I explained the impossible. Grammy's fish people were real. His disbelief turned to horror as he watched the merman. No, not a merman at all, but something far darker, gradually transform before our eyes. When I discovered that the creature's secret wasn't magic at all, but a parasitic infection twisting human bodies into water-bound abominations, my stomach churned. Roman's transformation began subtly, a trace of green on his cheek, then skin hardening into scales. Desperation replaced our initial fascination as the merman calmly explained that without the sea's embrace, Roman's body would wither beyond repair. In a moment of panic and grim determination, I retrieved a knife. Though every instinct screamed against it, I made a cut, following the creature's cold instructions to allow Roman's body to adapt. The act felt monstrous, and when I saw tiny, worm-like creatures writhing from his wound, I realized we were dealing with something that defied every natural law. As Roman's anguished pleas filled the air, I carried him to the shallow end and watched, numb, as the merman began the final transformation. Roman's body fused, his limbs merging into a tail, his eyes turning vacant. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy from this relentless horror, but my voice was lost in the chaos. In the days that followed, the house was never the same. Roman's disappearance was chalked up to a drowning, and while my parents planned to rent out the house for summer parties, I couldn't bear the thought of another soul stepping near the cursed pool. I spent every weekend scrubbing away the memory of bloodstains and broken dreams, yet the pool remained a magnet for the curious and the damned. Only recently, as spring break arrived, I returned to inspect the property. The cement patio was wet with rain and something else. Leaning casually against the pool's edge was a figure whose tail glistened in a sickly green-blue hue. My heart sank as I realized that the nightmare wasn't over. The grotesque parasite that had twisted Roman was still out there, lurking in the shallow water, drawing unsuspecting souls toward its malevolent tide. I stared at the creature as Roman's mocking laughter echoed from beneath the surface, a sound that blended human misery with the call of the deep. I scrambled for my phone to call my parents, but the sound of children's excited footsteps grew louder. One by one, they rushed toward the pool like moths to a flame. Their laughter and splashes soon turned to desperate screams as they vanished beneath the surface. Locked in my room, the world outside was unnaturally silent. I couldn't escape the merman's final words that still rang in my ears. 15 minutes. That's how long it takes for a human to lose their legs. I realized then that the curse was spreading, and with every new victim, the line between myth and reality blurred a little more. I sit here now, trembling in the silence, haunted by the realization that some legends never die, they only change form. It started with a glimpse. I was tidying up in the dim light of my apartment one chilly autumn evening when I noticed something strange in my bedroom mirror. At first, I assumed it was my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I had been working long hours at a job that drained every bit of my spirit, and I was hardly surprised when my vision blurred at the edges. But when I looked a second time, I saw that the reflection wasn't quite right. The face looking back wasn't entirely mine. There was a subtle distortion, a flicker of another presence lurking behind the contours of my own expression. That night, as I lay in bed with insomnia tugging at my sanity, I couldn't stop replaying that unnerving vision in my mind. I had inherited the mirror from my grandmother, a beautiful, antique piece with a carved wooden frame that told tales of old-world charm and mystery. It was something I'd always admired in family photos, an heirloom that spoke of generations past. But that night, it seemed less like a cherished relic and more like a window into an alternate reality. The following morning, determined to understand what I'd seen, I sat down in front of the mirror. I adjusted the lighting, fumbled with my phone to record a video, and even tried to gently wipe the glass, half expecting smudges to be the culprit. Yet nothing changed. My reflection appeared perfectly normal for a few seconds. Then, when I paused, I caught a fleeting image of a pale, gaunt face hovering just over my shoulder in the reflection, its eyes dark and sorrowful. I whipped around immediately, heart pounding, yet the room was empty. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light, the result of exhaustion. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror held secrets I was not meant to see. Over the next few nights, the odd occurrences escalated. I would catch glimpses of the figure whenever I wasn't paying full attention, at the corner of my eye, reflected in a window, or in the wavering image of my computer screen. One particularly restless night, I lay awake staring at the mirror. The familiar comfort of my reflection was gone, replaced by a stranger. My eyes met eyes that weren't entirely my own, features that seemed to blur the line between my identity and something unknown. The face in the mirror was intermittently overlaid with faint images, shadows of a long-forgotten sorrow, hints of a life I never lived but somehow recognized. It was as if the mirror held a portal to another existence. I began to research my family history in an attempt to uncover any mention of a cursed heirloom or ghostly phenomena linked to that mirror. My grandmother's journals, yellowed with time, spoke of peculiar dreams and mysterious visitations, but nothing explicit about the mirror itself. Still, she mentioned a vengeful-looking glass in passing, a term that chilled me to the core when I saw it written in her spidery hand. I combed through old letters, searching for any clue that might connect the dots. At times, sleep evaded me for nights on end, replaced with mind-racking anxieties and a persistent feeling of being watched. One evening, overwhelmed by a mix of dread and determination, I decided that confronting this phenomenon head-on was my only option. I set up cameras around my room to monitor every angle of the mirror. The first night of recording was uneventful. The footage showed nothing but my solitary, restless sleep and the ordinary ambience of a quiet apartment. But on the second night, something extraordinary happened. I awoke at 3:17 a.m., heart galloping, to the sound of soft scratching coming from behind the mirror. My eyes struggled to adjust in the darkness as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I shone its beam on the glass, I noticed faint, ghostly traces that looked like handprints scratched into the surface. They were too shallow to be real damage, yet they pulsed with a strange luminosity, as if alive. The following days became a blur of investigation and paranoia. I rewatched the footage repeatedly. In one segment, I saw the mirror's surface ripple as if disturbed by invisible fingers. My own reflection lagged behind my every movement, a slow, eerie delay. In another clip, the camera captured an entire sequence where my reflection's eyes darkened dramatically, and in one frame, I could swear the reflection was not mimicking my movements at all. Instead, it seemed to act independently, its head slowly tilting as though it were surveying me with an intelligence that was not mine. The more I watched, the more I began to believe that my mirror was more than just a piece of antique glass. It had become a conduit for something beyond ordinary comprehension. Sleep became a distant memory. The relentless horror of the mirror plagued my waking hours and taunted my nightmares. I tried to cover it up with a heavy blanket to hide from the unsettling visions it invoked, but that only seemed to worsen my isolation. Every time I removed the covering, the mirror greeted me with the unnerving possibility that something was waiting, something that was not me, but was an echo of me, an alternate version contorted by sorrow and regret. Desperation led me to confide in a close friend, Mark, whose rational mind had always been my anchor. He listened carefully as I described every detail, the inexplicable delays, the ghostly handprints, and the disembodied expressions. Mark suggested that stress and sleep deprivation might be amplifying my imagination, urging me to get help. I attempted to explain that it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. The evidence on the footage was irrefutable, but his skeptical eyes left me questioning if I was truly losing grip on reality. I began to wonder if I was experiencing a form of psychosis. However, one particular incident shattered that thought completely. One stormy, pitch-black night, I awoke to find the mirror completely dark. Not a trace of my face, nor any reflection of the room, only an impenetrable void. Panic surged through me. I fumbled to turn on all the lights, yet nothing changed. Slowly, as I sat terrified before this endless blackness, a movement caught my eye. From within that void emerged a shadow, a dark, wraith-like shape that approached with a deliberate slowness. It wasn't until the figure was nearly upon me that I saw the faintest glimmer in its eyes. They pulsed with an otherworldly light that made my blood run cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed by the relentless grip of fear. The shadow lingered, examining me with a silent intensity that spoke of centuries of despair. Then, just as silently, it receded back into the darkness. leaving the mirror as empty as if nothing had ever been there. The next morning, drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably, I forced myself to confront the mirror once more. I could no longer ignore what I had seen. I began an exhaustive documentation process, scribbling down every detail in a journal, noting the exact times of occurrences, and describing the ghostly features with painstaking precision. I even attempted to capture the moment using different cameras and settings, hoping that technology might offer an explanation. But each attempt only deepened the mystery. The mirror began to change its behavior subtly. On some days, it would show a flicker of a face from behind me. On others, it would seem to swell with a dark energy that pulsed in sync with the rhythm of my heartbeat. One particularly dismal afternoon, while leafing through the margins of my grandmother's old journals, I discovered an entry that chilled me to the core. The entry described a ritual of remembrance, a way for a restless spirit to communicate with the living. It mentioned that if a family heirloom, especially a mirror, did not reflect one's true self, it was because it was absorbing the soul of someone who was lost and yet still tethered to that world. According to the diary, the mirror would gradually reveal the image of the departed if the current occupant paid close attention. I felt as though each word was addressed to me, a warning or perhaps an explanation. Had this mirror been cursed long before it came into my possession? Was it possible that by merely gazing upon it, I was inadvertently inviting a lost soul into my life? The thought both fascinated and terrified me. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a desperate need for answers, I began to experiment. I stood before the mirror day after day, trying various rituals I found in the margins of old occult books, lighting candles in a circle around it, reciting spoken affirmations of remembrance, and even leaving objects that belonged to my family as offerings. In the quiet moments after these rituals, I sometimes caught fleeting glances of a face that wasn't mine, a young woman with sorrowful eyes and a faint smile of resignation. Her presence was neither malevolent nor protective. It was as though she existed solely to be acknowledged, to be remembered. As the weeks turned into a blur of sleepless nights and feverish investigations, I found myself becoming increasingly detached from who I had once been. My reflection, or rather the lack of it, became a daily torment. I would stand for hours in front of the mirror, watching as the comforting image of my own face wavered, replaced over and over with that mysterious, spectral visage. There were moments of eerie clarity when I almost believed the mirror was trying to tell me its story, a tale of loss, betrayal, and an unfulfilled promise that stretched back generations. I began to piece together fragments of a tragedy. A young woman named Isabella, whose life had been cut tragically short in a fire that consumed an old estate, leaving behind only whispers and scraps of her spirit trapped within the mirror. One night, emboldened by a sudden surge of determination, I addressed the mirror directly. "Who are you?" I demanded in a trembling voice. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with innumerable unspoken words. Then, in a voice that was not my own, but resonated as if from deep within a forgotten grave, the mirror replied, "I am she you lost. I am the one whose memory you dare not forget." The voice was sorrowful and ancient, echoing off the walls of my mind. It sent a shiver of both fear and pity through me. I felt tears streaming down my cheeks as I whispered back, "I will remember. I promise I will never forget." From that moment, the mirror's behavior changed ever so slightly. While it continued to play tricks on my mind in the dead of night, the spectral images became less erratic. There was a quiet rhythm to them now, a mournful cadence that spoke of deep, unending regret rather than pure malice. I began to understand that the mirror was not a monster to be vanquished. It was a relic filled with memories, a conduit for a lost soul desperate for acknowledgement. In its silent, reflective depths lay the ghost of a life abruptly ended, waiting for someone to listen, to remember, and perhaps to set it free. I dedicated myself to uncovering Isabella's story. I pored over county records, old newspapers, and family letters that had been tucked away in dusty attics. Over months of painstaking research, I assembled a mosaic of her life, a young woman of beauty and passion, whose life had been marred by misfortune, scandal, and ultimately, an untimely death in a fire rumored to have been no mere accident. Every clue I unearthed deepened my connection to her, and with every new fact, I felt the mirror's presence grow stronger, more resolute in its silent plea for remembrance. Some nights, as I sat alone in the flickering candlelight, I would feel her presence like a gentle caress, a reminder that Isabella's spirit was now a part of me. I began to see her not as a haunting specter, but as a tragic figure whose story demanded to be told. I created a small scrapbook filled with clippings, personal letters, and carefully transcribed interviews with people who remembered the old estate. I wrote down everything I discovered, and in the quiet spaces between my frantic research and weary sleep, I talked to her as if she were present, a conversation between a solitary soul and one lost in the annals of forgotten time. One particularly stormy night, when the wind howled like a chorus of mourning voices and rain battered the windows of my apartment, I made one last attempt to commune with the mirror. I arranged the items I had gathered, a faded photograph of Isabella in her youth, a weathered locket that had once belonged to her, and an old letter expressing her final, desperate hopes. I sat before the mirror, now illuminated solely by the erratic dance of lightning outside, and spoke softly. I have not forgotten you, Isabella. I promise your story will be heard. I will remember you, even if the world has long since cast you aside. For several agonizing minutes, the silence held me captive. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mirror's surface shimmered, and in that fleeting moment, I saw not my own face, but Isabella's. The sorrow in her eyes mingled with a gratitude so palpable it nearly moved me to tears. In that mystical exchange, I felt the crushing weight of decades of neglect and heartache lift ever so slightly. The mirror had served its purpose, not to terrify, but to remind me of the fragility of memory and the importance of bearing witness. And so, as dawn broke over a rain-soaked cityscape, I vowed to honor her legacy. I compiled everything I had learned into a small manuscript, a chronicle of her life and the dark secrets that had bound her to that cursed mirror. I shared her story on forums, in local historical societies, even with acquaintances who had once dismissed my ramblings as mere paranoia. Gradually, her tale began to take on a life of its own, a bittersweet blend of tragedy and remembrance that resonated with all who heard it. Now, years later, I still live with the echo of Isabella's sorrow. The mirror remains in my bedroom, a constant, silent witness to my efforts to remember. And sometimes, on quiet nights, as I lie awake and gaze into its depths, I see her smile, a small, fleeting expression of peace, as if finally freed from the shackles of a tragic past. I know that I carry a responsibility, not just to myself, but to all those lost souls whose stories are bound to the objects we inherit. The mirror that once failed to reflect me now reflects something more, a shared humanity, a connection between past and present, a reminder that in the silent corners of our lives, memory and loss often walk hand in hand. As the seasons change and I grow older, the terror of that mirror has transformed into a profound sense of duty. I have learned that even the most unnerving phenomena can hold within them a message of hope and redemption. Isabella's spirit, once trapped by the cruelty of fate, now lingers as a gentle reminder that we must never forget the stories of those who have been erased by time. In every scratch on the glass, in every fleeting flicker of shadow, there is a whisper urging us to remember, to acknowledge the beauty and tragedy of lives that once burned so brightly. I often wonder if others have experienced similar encounters with heirlooms or artifacts that bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Perhaps, in some quiet attic or forgotten room, there exists another mirror that does not simply reflect one's image, but offers a passage into hidden histories. For me, Isabella's mirror has become a daily meditation, a source of both terror and solace. And as I continue to care for it and keep her story alive through my writing and research, I take comfort in the realization that even in the darkest reflections, there can be light, if only we dare to remember. The mirror that didn't reflect me is my testament to the intricate tapestry of memory, loss, and the indomitable human spirit. In a world that often forgets too quickly, the most haunted mirrors may well be those that hold the faces of the forgotten. And if you ever find yourself facing a mirror that seems not to reflect you at all, pause for a moment, listen to its silent language, and remember that sometimes the past reaches out for acknowledgement in the most unexpected ways. It began on an ordinary, rain-soaked night when I finally decided to claim the old house I had long dreamed of owning. I'd passed over many modern apartments and brand new townhouses, but something about the faded wood, the creaking floors, and the storied past of this aging structure beckoned me. I knew from the very first visit that the house held secrets behind every locked door and dusty corner. I wasn't sure what those secrets might be, but the feeling that I was meant to uncover them was irresistible. The day I moved in was a blur of unpacking boxes, organizing old heirlooms left behind by the previous owners, and silent, almost reverent exploration. The house was a sprawling, two-story building with a peculiar layout, a narrow staircase that descended beneath the main floor to a basement I had scarcely noticed. I asked the realtor about it, and he'd merely shrugged, saying, "It's been empty as long as anyone can remember." I never thought much about it at the time. That first night, after I had set up a modest dinner at my reclaimed dining table and settled in with a book and a cup of lukewarm tea, I began to hear a sound that made me freeze in my armchair. It was faint at first, a soft, persistent creak that seemed to echo from below. I told myself it was just the old house settling in the cool night air. The rain pattered against the window, and all seemed calm. Yet, as the hours of darkness deepened, the sound grew unmistakably deliberate. A slow, measured thump, as if heavy footsteps were pacing down the hallway of the basement. At 2:13 a.m., I was finally roused from a restless sleep by the unmistakable groan of the house. I lay there in the silence for what seemed like an eternity before bolting upright. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. That sound, an uneven, shuffling noise, seemed to be coming from the floor below. I remembered the narrow staircase tucked away in a dark corner of the living room, its entrance partly hidden by a threadbare rug. Though I had ignored it at move-in, I now realized that the basement must hold more than just storage. Perhaps it was where the history of this house was kept hidden, locked away from prying eyes. I rose, heart in my throat, and made my way over to the stairs. Every step creaked and moaned beneath my weight, each sound amplifying the lurking dread that I couldn't dispel. With the beam of my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand, I descended into the darkness. The air was cold and musty, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and inexplicable. The narrow staircase led me downward in a slow spiral until I finally reached the basement door. Before I could push it open, I hesitated, swallowed hard, and listened. There it was again, the sound of footsteps, irregular and heavy, echoing like the measured pacing of an unseen presence. I pressed my ear against the cold, warped wood of the door, my skin prickling as I strained to catch even the faintest detail. There was silence on the other side now, yet I knew better than to trust that silence. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned the rusty knob and slowly eased the door open. A weak shaft of light revealed a sprawling space that stretched into shadows, far larger than I'd imagined. The basement was cluttered with remnants of a forgotten era, old furniture draped in tattered sheets, stacks of dusty crates, and cobwebs glistening in the faint glow of my phone's light. In one corner, against a sagging wall, stood a large armoire draped in dark cloth. The atmosphere pressed in on me as I stepped inside. Every breath felt labored, as though I were inhaling the very grief and regret that had seeped into these walls over countless years. I wandered slowly among the relics, noticing details that made my skin crawl. Faded photographs in sepia tones that captured families long gone, letters and documents with dates that stretched back nearly 100 years, and odd trinkets whose purpose I could not decipher. I began to wonder if these items were deliberately arranged as if to tell a story, a message left by those who had once inhabited this space. In the midst of exploring, I stumbled upon something far more disturbing. A set of fresh muddy footprints leading from the heavy armoire toward a narrow doorway in the far wall. The print was unmistakably human, though the ground in this long abandoned basement had been undisturbed for decades. And yet, here were these footprints, small, erratic, like those of a child, fresh in a place that should have been long forgotten. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been living here in secret? Had a lost child once wandered these corridors and been trapped? I couldn't decide whether the footprints were evidence of a sleeping presence or the result of my own overactive imagination. Despite my horror, I felt an irresistible urge to follow the trail. With cautious steps, I advanced deeper into the basement, following the trail as it curved around old workbenches and piles of discarded newspapers. Every so often, I would stop, heart pounding, to listen for any sound that might confirm my worst fears. The passageway led me to a narrow hall lined with ancient, cracked stone walls. A few rusted light fixtures hung precariously above, casting weak, uneven illumination across a series of closed, wooden doors. The footprints stopped abruptly at one of the doors, a heavy door with peeling paint and a large, ornate knocker molded in the shape of a snarling beast. I pushed my fingers against the door, feeling the chill of the surface. For a moment, I considered retreating, wondering if I'd inadvertently disturbed something I was never meant to uncover. But something deep inside, perhaps a mixture of morbid curiosity and an inexplicable sense of duty, forced me to continue. I slowly opened the door, half expecting it to creak in protest. Inside was a small, private room that looked entirely out of place. Instead of the musty, cluttered chaos of the rest of the basement, this room was organized almost as if it were a study from a bygone era. A large desk dominated the space, its surface covered with yellowed papers, faded photographs, and an assortment of old, leather-bound books. The walls were lined with shelves that held delicate porcelain figurines and antique trinkets. In the center of the room, perched on a pedestal, was a large mirror framed in elaborate, dark wood. For a moment, its presence startled me. Why would this mirror, so pristine compared to the decay around it, be preserved in this secret chamber? As I stepped inside, the door closed behind me with a definitive click, echoing like a final sentence in an old, tragic story. My eyes were immediately drawn to the desk. A journal lay open, its pages scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. I approached slowly and began to read. The journal detailed the recollections of someone who had lived in the house long ago, a person whose words bled with sorrow and regret. The entry spoke of a terrible family secret, of a daughter taken too soon, of a promise broken by the cruelty of fate. The author wrote of a hidden room where she had concealed evidence of the tragedy, and of a mirror that was said to hold the soul of the lost child. I felt a chill that wasn't entirely due to the cold. The entries mentioned the child's name, Lillian, and described how, in the later years, the mirror would sometimes show a faint image of her sorrowful face when the author's anguish became too great to bear. At that moment, I understood that I had stumbled upon the basement's secret, a hidden chapter of the house history that had been deliberately locked away, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. The footprints, the secret passageways, and even the locked door, all of it made sense now. The author of the journal had been a desperate soul, trying to preserve the memory of her only child, Lillian, whose life had been snuffed out by a series of misfortunes and unspoken family rivalries. The mirror, preserved in that private room, was said to be the final connection between the living and the dead, a portal for the child's spirit to remain tethered to this world. I sat down at the desk, overwhelmed by a mix of sorrow and terror. My own heart ached as I read about a life filled with loss and guilt, the desperate longing of a mother to see her child one last time. Every word in the journal carried an emotional weight that made the air in the secret study feel nearly unbearable. I could almost hear the muffled cries of a broken family echoing softly through the silence. Outside the room, footsteps began to stir once again, this time gentler, as if in cautious warning rather than threat. The sound was deliberate, measured, and filled with a strange sort of sorrow. Unable to resist the pull of the unknown, I rose from the desk and moved toward the mirror. Its surface was flawless and dark, reflecting not just my own terrified face, but also a superimposed image that chilled me to the bone. For just an instant, I saw a small figure, a little girl in a pale dress with tear-stained cheeks, standing behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the room was empty save for the heavy silence and the ghost of grief that permeated every corner. I turned back to the mirror, only to see the figure again. The girl's eyes met mine with a desperate pleading, as though trying to communicate a message that transcended the barrier between the living and the dead. It was in that moment that I began to suspect that the footprints I had followed were not made by someone still alive, but rather by a spectral remnant, a child whose small feet had once padded innocently across these floors. Perhaps Lillian's spirit had roamed these corridors searching for the love and recognition that had been denied to her in life. The journal's final entry had ended abruptly, the ink nearly smeared by tears. If anyone finds this, know that I have lost everything. Lillian, my darling, I cannot keep you hidden forever. I beg you to be remembered. That plea reverberated in my mind as I stared into the mirror. For hours, I sat in that secret study, the storm outside intensifying as if echoing the tumult within me. I resolved then that I could not let this tragic story fade into oblivion. I gathered the journal, a few of the fragile photographs, and copies of the old newspaper clippings I had found scattered in the basement. With shaking hands, I documented every detail, determined to piece together the full truth of what had transpired in this accursed house. I made several trips between the secret study and the main areas of the basement, searching for additional clues, hidden compartments in the walls, engraved initials on ancient beams, faded handprints on long-forgotten artifacts. Each discovery pulled me deeper into the sorrowful tale of Lillian and the mother who had tried in vain to preserve her memory. The basement itself seemed to transform during my investigation. Shadows lengthened and shifted in a way that suggested the lingering presence of old sorrows. It was as if the very walls exhaled memories of heartbreak and remorse, and the ambient noises, dripping water, creaking floors, the soft hum of a long-dead air conditioner, blended with whispers of the past. I found myself speaking aloud, asking questions into the darkness, hoping that somewhere amid the echoes I would hear the answer. Lillian, can you hear me? I'd call softly, and sometimes for a heartbeat, I felt that the air vibrated with a response, a faint, indistinct murmur that might have been a sigh or perhaps a plea. Weeks merged into one another as I dedicated myself to unraveling the basement's secret. Each night, after ensuring the house was locked tight, I would descend into that labyrinth of sorrow with my camera and notebook, retracing the footsteps etched into the dust. I began to record the eerie sounds and capture images that defied conventional explanation. Flickering lights in abandoned corners, a child's laughter echoing faintly, though no living soul should be present, even moments when the mirror in the secret study reflected not my own face, but that of a small, weeping child. Sometimes I would find new sets of muddy footprints leading away from the study into even darker recesses that I had never seen before. I followed those trails with a mix of dread and determination, too afraid to look back yet compelled to uncover every hidden part of the tragic tapestry that clung to this house. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls and the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, I uncovered a final piece of evidence. In a cramped, neglected storage room off the main basement corridor, I discovered a trunk partially hidden beneath a faded tarpaulin. Inside lay a collection of personal belongings, a small, worn teddy bear, a lock of hair sealed in a faded envelope, and a delicate silver locket engraved with the initials R. My hands trembled as I opened the locket, and inside was a tiny, sepia-toned photograph of a little girl whose sad eyes looked eerily like the apparition I had seen. This confirmation shattered any remaining hope that the haunting was but my imagination. I was in the grip of something far more real than I could have ever believed, a curse of memory and mourning that had persisted in the silence of these walls. I spent the following days compiling every scrap of documentation, every photograph, every handwritten note. I reached out to local historians and scoured old records to understand the tragic fate of Lillian and her family. I learned that the house had once belonged to a prominent family whose reputation was marred by scandal and loss. Lillian, it turned out, had been a bright, gentle child caught in the crossfire of family secrets and a bitter feud that led to a series of misfortunes culminating in a mysterious fire. The tragedy was hushed up, the memories deliberately obscured by those who wished to forget. And now, her spirit, along with that of her grieving mother, seemed to haunt the basement, the last bastion of their shattered past. With time, I began to feel that my role in this unfolding drama was not that of a mere intruder, but of a reluctant chronicler, a person entrusted with the responsibility to remember and bear witness. I created an extensive archive, digitizing photographs, transcribing every journal entry, and even publishing fragments of the story on local forums, urging anyone who might have even the faintest recollection of Lillian to come forward. The response was both heart-wrenching and bizarre. Some recounted long-forgotten family stories. Others whispered that they'd heard similar sounds in their own homes. I became a repository for the collective grief of a past generation desperate to be seen. Yet even as I documented her tragic history, the supernatural events in the basement grew more insistent. At night, I would lie awake, my eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, listening to the rhythmic thumping of footsteps and distant voices. There were moments when I could feel a cold hand brush against mine as I walked past the closed storage rooms, or when a child's giggle echoed softly, only to vanish like a mirage. The presence in the basement was not malevolent. There was a deep, overwhelming sadness in its echoes, but it was insistent, a constant reminder of a wound that had never healed. One evening, after an exhausting day of investigation and record-keeping, I returned to the secret study to find it transformed. The mirror, which had previously held only fleeting images of a weeping child, now burned with a steady, ghostly light. In its reflection, I saw not myself, but a full, sorrowful apparition, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face etched with grief and resignation. She appeared to be silently pleading with me, her eyes silently demanding that the truth of her loss be acknowledged. For what seemed like hours, I stood there transfixed, unable to tear my gaze away from the haunting image. In that moment, I finally understood that the basement's secret was not simply a series of random hauntings. It was a call to remember, to honor the legacy of pain and tragedy that had been walled away for far too long. I gathered my courage and addressed the apparition aloud. I will remember you. I promise I will not let your story fade into oblivion. Whether it was my words or the raw emotion behind them, the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a bittersweet relief. The apparition slowly faded, leaving behind only the soft glow of the mirror and the quiet thud of my own heartbeat. I knew that the process of healing would be long and agonizing, but at least, for now, I had done my part to break the silence. Even now, as I live in a new home and try to bury the memories of that haunted basement beneath layers of routine and modernity, I often hear the echo of those footsteps late at night. I preserve the journal and photographs in a safe place and continue to share Lillian's story with anyone willing to listen. The basement's secret is now a part of me, a reminder that the past never truly dies, and that every house, every relic, can harbor stories too painful to forget. I have learned that facing the ghosts of our history, however tragic and unsettling, is the only way to bring some measure of light into the darkness. In the echoing corridors of that basement, I found not just horror, but the profound, aching beauty of memory, loss, and ultimately, redemption. And so, whenever I hear a stray noise or catch a glimpse of a shadow in a quiet room, I pause, remember, and honor those who came before me, lest their secrets be lost in the silence forever. The Basement Secret is my chronicle of a journey deep into the heart of a house haunted by grief, where every creak and dusty footprint speaks of lives once lived and lost. In uncovering its hidden sorrow, I found the courage to confront my own isolation and the importance of remembering the past. May this story serve as a reminder that even in our darkest, most forgotten corners, the echoes of our history call out, waiting to be heard. I always believed that solitude, when properly embraced, could be a healing balm for the weary soul. After years spent in a bustling apartment filled with constant chatter and clanging traffic, I longed for a quiet retreat, a place where I could finally assemble my thoughts in peace. When I found the old Victorian house at the outskirts of town, its weathered facade and lush, overgrown garden whispered promises of isolation and introspection. The price was modest, almost suspiciously so, yet something in its melancholic charm beckoned me. I moved in with the naive hope that I was finally claiming a sanctuary from the relentless pace of modern life. The first few weeks were blissfully quiet. I reveled in the creaks of the ancient floorboards and the murmuring wind outside the narrow windows. There was, however, an intangible quality to the house, a subtle sense of being observed. At first, I dismissed it as a vestige of my own imagination, or perhaps the residue of past memories. It was only during the long nights, when the world was shrouded in darkness, that I began to notice little details that defied explanation. The faint rustle of paper where there should be nothing, an inexplicable shift in the temperature around me, and most disturbingly, a sealed envelope that appeared seemingly out of nowhere. I discovered the envelope on a particularly stormy evening. The rain had pounded relentlessly against the windows while I sat at my long, scarred desk in the study, drinking a single cup of bitter coffee. The power had flickered earlier, and I had been left with only the dim light of a solitary lamp and the sporadic flash of lightning outside. Between the rhythmic patter of rain and the creaks of the old building, a shape had caught my eye, an envelope, pristine white and untouched by time, lying inexplicably on a bookshelf that had belonged to the previous owner. I distinctly remembered placing every item away in its proper place that afternoon while unpacking. There was no record of an envelope here, nothing that I remembered receiving from anyone. It was addressed to me in elegant, cursive handwriting. The return address was simply marked with an archaic symbol I couldn't decipher. The envelope was sealed with a red wax stamp bearing a mark that looked almost like a family crest or perhaps an unfamiliar emblem of sorrow. My heart pounded in my chest as I held the envelope in trembling hands. Every rational part of my mind urged me to dismiss it as a clerical error or a misdirected piece of mail. But my intuition screamed that there was something far more sinister at play. I placed the envelope on the desk, hesitating before finally peeling back the seal. The flap opened with a soft crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent study, as though it were the opening act to a horrifying performance. Inside the envelope lay a single sheet of paper, its surface covered in fluid, looping handwriting. I read the message slowly, each word echoing in my mind with a haunting resonance. I know your secrets. I see you every day as you walk these halls. I have watched you from the shadows and memorized every detail of your life, even before you arrived here. Beware the mirror, the voices, the footsteps. When you feel that cold on your neck, know that I am near. Do not forget me. The message sent a chill down my spine. I sat frozen, the paper quivering slightly in my grip, as if imbued with a life of its own. I reread the letter multiple times, desperate to ensure that my fatigued eyes had not deceived me. There was something disturbingly intimate in the words, a knowledge of routines, of habits, of moments so private that only an intimate observer could have witnessed them. I began to question every instance of unexplained coincidence that had occurred since moving into the house. Had I truly been alone? Or had someone been lurking in the background, silently observing? That very night, sleep abandoned me. I lay awake in the darkened bedroom, eyes darting nervously around the room as every creak and groan of the old house assumed an ominous meaning. The envelope and its cryptic message played continuously in my mind, each word a refrain that repeated over and over. I wondered, who was watching me? What did they want? And how were they connected to this house, this relic of forgotten days? In the days that followed, I began to meticulously document every unusual occurrence. I set up a small notebook on my bedside table, jotting down every instance that defied mundane explanation. A shadow at the corner of my vision, the sound of soft footsteps in an empty corridor, a whispered phrase that I could not place. I even tried to trace the symbol on the envelope's wax seal by searching through old books and online archives, but nothing I found matched. It was an enigma, a key with no known lock, and it haunted every moment of my waking hours. One afternoon, determined to dispel my growing unease, I decided to retrace my movements from the day I had arrived. I meticulously reviewed every room, every corridor, seeking any sign that someone had been in my house before I did. I even searched the attic and basement, but nothing out of the ordinary appeared. Yet, in every reflective surface, the mirror in the hallway, a dusty photograph in a tarnished frame, I began to suspect that the envelope's promise was true. I saw, for a fraction of a second, impressions of a figure behind me, or a flicker of an eye that wasn't mine. These moments were fleeting, but they planted seeds of terror that grew with each passing day. That evening, as I sat in the study once more, I found myself drawn to the mirror that hung above the fireplace, a large, ornate piece that once belonged to the family that had owned this home before me. Its surface was polished to a sheen, reflecting the candlelight in delicate, wavering patterns. I stared deeply into it, half expecting the reflection to betray some hidden truth. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, I saw a subtle change. My own reflection began to lag ever so slightly, as if trapped behind a pane of glass that was slowly warping. For a moment, the reflection seemed to soften, blurring the features that I had known so well. I blinked rapidly, hoping it was a trick of the light, but the delay persisted. Then, in one blink, the image of a small, ghostly face appeared superimposed over mine, a face of a little girl with sorrowful eyes and a faint, pleading expression. I gasped, and for several agonizing seconds, I could not tear my eyes away. The apparition in the mirror was not static. Her expression shifted from pleading to wistful, her eyes silently communicating a story of abandonment and loss. I felt an overwhelming sadness, almost as if I were absorbing her heartbreak. Had she been the one whose absence was alluded to in the letter? The message in the envelope hinted at secrets and forgotten tragedies, and now I wondered if this ghostly child was the key. I reached out with a trembling hand toward the mirror, but as soon as my fingers grazed the glass, the image flickered and vanished, leaving only my own terrified reflection. I sat back, heart pounding, as the room grew oppressively still. Every sound, every whisper of the wind outside, now took on a new, menacing quality, a reminder that something was watching from beyond the veil. I decided then that I could no longer live in a state of constant vigilance and dread. I must discover the truth behind the envelope and the spectral child in the mirror, even if it meant unraveling a mystery best left untouched. I began my search in earnest. Late at night, when the house was swallowed by darkness, I combed through old family records, local archives, and even the brittle pages of the previous owner's diaries that I had found in the attic. I learned that the house had a troubled past, a legacy filled with whispered rumors and unspoken tragedies. According to a faded newspaper article dated 1938, the family that once lived here had lost a beloved daughter under mysterious circumstances. The article was vague, a mere snippet of scandal and heartbreak, but it mentioned a child who had vanished without a trace. Other documents hinted at strange occurrences. Old letters from a grieving mother spoke of the unseen watcher, and a mirror said to hold the secret of her soul. As I pieced together these fragments, a disquieting picture began to form. The envelope's intimate language and the appearance of the ghostly girl in the mirror were inextricably linked to that unspeakable loss. The watchers mentioned in the letters seemed to be a part of the family's lore, a cautionary tale passed down in hushed tones. There were even local legends circulating among elder residents about a child who appeared in mirrors on stormy nights, begging silently to be remembered. I decided to conduct a ritual of remembrance, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. One night, amidst a lashing rainstorm, I arranged the following items on my desk: a single white rose plucked from the overgrown garden, the envelope and its cryptic note, and a small, antique locket I had found tucked away in a drawer that once belonged to the previous owner. I dimmed the lights and lit 3 candles around the mirror. With shaking hands, I recited an old verse I found in one of the diaries, an invocation meant to summon the voice of the forgotten. Spirits of loss and time's embrace, show us the truth in your silent face. Let the whispers of sorrow now be heard. Unseal the secrets in this cold, dark word. For long minutes, nothing happened except the sound of the rain and the steady flicker of the candle flames. Then, the mirror began to ripple as if disturbed by a gentle breeze. Slowly, a face emerged, a face both tender and anguished, that of a little girl whose eyes brimmed with unspoken longing. I felt tears welling up as she stared at me, her gaze heavy with a mix of hope and despair. The room seemed to pulse with the intensity of that silent communication, the air thick with an almost palpable sadness. The apparition's eyes communicated a silent plea. "Remember me," I whispered back, voice cracking with emotion. "I will. I promise I will remember you." And then, as quickly as she had appeared, the image faded, leaving behind only the trembling candlelight and the echo of my own heartbeat. Yet, that was not the end. In the days that followed, my nights were consumed by bizarre occurrences that defied easy explanation. I discovered new, fresh markings on the walls near the mirror, symbols that I couldn't decipher, but which seemed to radiate sorrow and urgency. At times, I would hear the sound of soft sobbing echoing through the corridors, as if a grieving child wandered the halls in search of her lost memories. Doors that I had long since locked would creak open on their own, and in the quiet of the night, I sometimes caught a glimpse of a tiny handprint on a dusty surface, one that did not belong to any living soul in my household. I began to record these phenomena. Every night, I set up my camera in front of the mirror, hoping to capture even a moment of the spectral girl's presence. Some nights, the footage would show nothing more than my own restlessness, but on others, I saw fleeting images, a pair of eyes glistening in the dim light, a shadow slithering across the glass, a slight movement that defied the ordinary. These records, however imperfect, only deepened my obsession with the mystery of the envelope and the ghost who haunted it. I reached out to local historians and even a paranormal investigator recommended by a friend. Most of them dismissed my findings as natural occurrences in an old house, a combination of settling wood, flickering reflections, and the power of suggestion. But the investigator, a wiry man with deep-set eyes named Mr. Aldridge, listened intently and examined the envelope and my notes with a seriousness that unsettled me further. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the past refuses to be buried. It finds a way to resurface, demanding recognition. Your envelope and this mirror, it's as if they're vessels for memories that were never allowed to die." His words echoed in my mind for weeks, fueling both my determination and my dread. One night, determined to confront the phenomenon head-on, I set up an elaborate session in the study where the mirror hung. I invited Mr. Aldrich to join me, hoping that together we could coax the truth from the darkened glass. With the room bathed in the unsteady glow of candlelight and the persistent murmur of rain outside, we sat in silence for what seemed like an agonizing eternity. Then, as if on cue, the mirror began to shimmer. Slowly, the image of the little girl reappeared, this time clear and unmistakable. Her eyes met mine, a silent torrent of emotion pouring forth. Mr. Aldrich's expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between fascination and horror. The girl's reflection remained fixed for what seemed like hours, conveying a story without uttering a single word. I sensed her profound loneliness and the weight of a tragedy long past. In that moment, I understood that she was not merely a ghost, but the last remnant of a family's broken legacy, a soul abandoned by time and forgotten by the world. She was pleading for someone to acknowledge her existence, to recount the truth of her short, painful life, and to allow her memory to live on. As the session drew to a close, the mirror's image faded once more, leaving us drenched in a silence that felt both heavy and hopeful. Mr. Aldrich and I sat there for a long while, each lost in our own thoughts. I resolved then that I would not allow the memory of this lost soul to vanish into obscurity. I would gather every shred of evidence, every faded record, every whispered rumor regarding the family that once inhabited this house. I would learn her name, her story, and I would tell it to the world. I began a rigorous investigation. Over the ensuing weeks, I scoured local archives, dug through old newspapers, and even approached elderly residents who might recall hints of scandal or tragedy surrounding the house. Slowly, an agonizing narrative emerged. The house had once belonged to a prosperous family whose happiness was shattered by an unspeakable loss. The daughter, a delicate child with an affinity for playing by the mirror, had suffered from a mysterious illness and died abruptly under tragic circumstances. Her mother, overwhelmed by grief, was said to have made desperate attempts to preserve her daughter's memory, endeavors that ultimately led to whispered legends of a cursed mirror and cryptic messages delivered in sealed envelopes. Every new piece of information felt like a key turning in a long unlocked lock, opening a door to hidden truths. I even found a crumbling photograph tucked inside an old book in the local library. A faded image of a young girl in a frilly dress, her eyes mirroring the sorrow I had seen in the mirror. Next to her in the photograph, barely visible, was a woman whose expression was one of profound despair. I was convinced that the photograph was evidence of the family's downfall, a moment captured before the house became haunted by tragedy. Reinvigorated by the pieces of the puzzle, I dedicated myself entirely to preserving and publicizing her story. I started a blog detailing every discovery and every odd experience that I had endured since receiving that ominous envelope. The blog quickly gained a modest following. Others were intrigued by the tale of the haunted mirror, the ghostly child, and the unresolved mystery of the old house. Comments poured in from readers who claimed to have experienced similar phenomena in their own homes, and some even offered to share their own family lore. It was as if my story had tapped into a universal longing to remember the forgotten tragedies of the past. At night, I continued my solitary vigils before the mirror, sometimes leaving a small offering, a white rose, a handwritten note of remembrance, or a locket containing a recent photograph of myself. Each time I would whisper, "I remember you, and I will never let you fade away." And occasionally, the mirror would respond with a flicker, a tear sliding down a spectral cheek, or a brief glimpse of a smile that was both tragic and tender. These moments, though fleeting, filled me with a bittersweet mixture of relief and heartache. I knew that I was merely a vessel now, entrusted with the duty to honor a life that had been brutally cut short. One evening, as autumn bled into winter and the nights became oppressively long, I experienced something that defied explanation even by the standards of my haunted existence. I had finished drafting a detailed account of Lillian's, or rather Isabella's, as the documents revealed her name to be, tragic story, and decided to read it aloud in the study, as if speaking it might anchor her memory in the fabric of the house. I sat before the mirror, the old envelope placed reverently beside my open journal, and began to recite the chronicle of her life, her illness, her untimely death, and the desperate pleas of her mother. My voice shook as I narrated the final, wrenching line. May you be remembered, now and forever, as you fade from our world. As the last word trembled into silence, the room seemed to pause. The candle flames flickered violently, and in that turbulent moment, the mirror burst into a cascade of light. For what seemed like an eternity in that single heartbeat, I was no longer alone. The reflection transformed into a vivid tableau, a scene from a long-forgotten past. I saw a young girl in a pristine white dress standing in a sunlit garden, surrounded by laughing family members whose joy was palpable and yet tinged with an undercurrent of sorrow. I saw her mother, dressed in mourning, reaching out toward the child with desperate, forlorn eyes. And then I saw fire, a great blaze that consumed everything the horrific moment of loss captured in slow motion. The figures in the reflection moved with agonizing clarity. I could feel the heat of the flames and the sheer agony of the moment, as if the mirror was not merely showing me a memory, but inviting me to relive an ancient trauma. I gasped, unable to tear my eyes away, as the scene dissolved gradually into darkness. Once the flames faded, the mirror returned to its quiet, haunted state, but something had shifted irrevocably. The encounter confirmed for me that the envelope had not been a mere anomaly, but a deliberate message, a call from the past intended to awaken me to a legacy of loss and unfulfilled promises. I now understood that every flicker of the mirror, every whisper in the dark, was a plea for acknowledgement from those who had been silenced by time. In the weeks and months that followed, I vowed to keep their memories alive. I published my blog and reached out to local media, sharing the tragic history of the house and the spectral evidence that had become intertwined with my life. The response was a mixture of empathy, curiosity, and a touch of skepticism, but mostly it was a reminder that the past has a way of resurfacing, especially when people are willing to listen. Even now, long after I have left that haunted Victorian house and settled in a quieter part of town, I still receive occasional mail, sealed envelopes with no return address, bearing cryptic messages that echo the original warning. Sometimes, on stormy nights, I find myself gazing into a mirror and catching a glimpse of a tiny face in the reflection, a small, ghostly visage that seems to say, "Remember me." And in those moments, I remind myself of the promise I made on that dark, unforgettable night, that I would never let the silent voices of the past fade into oblivion. The unopened envelope is more than just a chilling account of one person's descent into fear and mystery. It is a testament to the enduring power of memory and the inexplicable forces that bind us to our history. In discovering that envelope and unraveling its secrets, I learned that even in solitude, we are never truly alone. The ghosts of our past linger in the quiet corners of life, waiting for someone to remember, and sometimes that remembrance is the only way to grant them peace. I had always felt a comfortable solitude in my old family home, a place full of memories, creaking floorboards, and the subtle hush of age. That late autumn evening, as I sat alone in the living room with only the soft glow of a single lamp to break the darkness, I began to wonder if the quiet was perhaps a little too quiet. The wind outside rattled against the window panes and rain drummed on the roof, but there was something else, a series of faint, deliberate thumps echoing from above. At first, I assumed it was merely the settling of an old house against a chill night. I had spent the afternoon cleaning and organizing, and maybe the temperature drop had caused the wood to contract. But as minutes turned to hours, the thumping grew more insistent. Every so often, I would pause mid-sip of my lukewarm tea and strain to listen, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching. I remembered childhood warnings about the attic. My mother once told me, with a half smile that was meant to gently tease, "Don't ever go up there after dark, dear." Some secrets are better left forgotten. At the time, I'd laughed it off. But now, alone in this vast, creaking house, those old tales of a restless presence lurking among dust and forgotten relics began to feel all too real. I tried to distract myself by flicking through an old photo album. The images of sunlit days and smiling faces did little to quiet the rising tension. Instead, an icy dread crept over me every time I caught a sound, a soft rustling in the ceiling, a scrape as if an object were dragging along the beams. I could almost swear I heard a whisper, indistinct yet laden with a meaning I couldn't fathom. After what felt like an eternity, I stood and approached the narrow doorway that led to the attic. The door, painted a faded pale blue, hung slightly off its hinges. Its peeling paint and age-worn brass handle gave it an aura of melancholy abandonment. I hesitated at its threshold, half expecting to hear something from within, maybe a rasping voice or even the quiet sound of a psalm. Instead, there was only silence. I flicked on my cell phone's flashlight and, with trembling hands, pushed open the door. A burst of stale, dust-laden air enveloped me as the old wooden stairs creaked under my weight. I climbed slowly, each step punctuated by the echo of my rising heartbeat. The atmosphere grew thicker the higher I ascended, a mix of despair, hidden grief, and a sense of foreboding that prickled at the back of my neck. At the top of the stairs, I paused at the narrow entryway. The attic revealed itself in weak, spectral light that streamed through a grimy window. Boxes, old furniture shrouded in yellowing sheets, and cobweb trinkets filled the space, each relic a silent witness to the passage of time. Yet, in the far corner of the room, I sensed movement, a dark, indistinct shape that didn't belong among the dusty antiques. I aimed the beam of my phone's light at the shape. For an instant, the darkness receded, and I saw nothing but shadows. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it reappeared. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing in the dim haze near a battered mirror, was a figure as vague as smoke. Its form was human enough, shoulders stooped, head slightly bowed, but its eyes were the most unnerving part. Deep, hollow voids that seemed to blink in and out of existence, as if they were trying to tell me a secret. I froze on the spot, my mind racing. Was this a trick of the light? Had my imagination, fueled by too many late-night horror movies, finally gotten the better of me? The figure did not move, yet I felt as though its gaze bore into the very soul of my being. Every instinct urged me to run down the stairs, to retreat back to the safety of the living room, but a deeper, inexplicable compulsion held me there. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper floated through the stagnant air. I couldn't make out the words, but they carried a weight that pressed against my chest like a physical burden. I know you. The sound seemed to say, trailing off into a faint wail that mingled with the moan of the wind outside. It wasn't a familiar voice, and it filled me with a primal terror that I had long thought belonged only in nightmares. I wanted to call out, to demand that the presence show itself or speak clearly, but the sound died in my throat. Instead, I stood in that oppressive silence, paralyzed by the intensity of my own fear and the weight of the unknown. In that moment, every creak of the wood and every exhale of the wind sounded like a deliberate message, a coded invitation to confront something buried deep within the house history, or perhaps within my own troubled memories. Gathering every ounce of courage, I stepped forward into the center of the attic. The beam of my light wavered as my hand trembled uncontrollably. I moved closer to the mirror, where the figure seemed most concentrated, and in its reflection I caught a glimpse of something more, a flash of an old photograph pinned crookedly to the wall behind it. I couldn't tell at first, but as I drew near, I recognized it as a portrait of a solemn young woman with sorrowful eyes. A date scrawled at the bottom read 1912. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces began to merge in my mind. My grandmother had once told me stories of a tragic occurrence in this house, a long ago death, a mysterious loss, and a promise that the spirit of the departed would forever roam the upper floors, seeking recognition and closure. Had I unwittingly provoked this specter simply by setting foot in the very place where it once lived? Or was it that the presence had lain dormant, waiting for me, the new occupant, to stir it awake? The atmosphere thickened, and the air grew colder. The figure in the mirror began to shift imperceptibly, its form elongating and contracting as if struggling against some unseen force. I could now distinctly see a pair of lips part in a silent plea, and in that fleeting moment, a torrent of images flooded my mind. Memories of a life before a sudden, inexplicable tragedy, the sound of laughter silenced by sorrow, the echo of footsteps in an empty corridor, and a desperate cry for help that went unanswered. The figure moved with an unnatural fluidity toward me. I felt as though it was not merely an image, but a presence, a being desperate to make contact. I took a cautious step back, my entire body trembling as if iced over. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from both nowhere and everywhere, it whispered, "Remember. Please remember." I stared at the words, caught between disbelief and terror. What did it mean? Was it pleading for recognition of a forgotten history, a forgotten name? Was it warning me of a danger that loomed over this place? My mind churned with questions, and each creak of the ancient wood felt like an answer I was too afraid to hear. The oppressive silence broke with a sudden, harsh sound, a loud thump behind me that resounded through the attic like a final, ominous drum. I spun around, heart in my throat, only to see the heavy shadow of a large trunk sliding slightly across the floor. Nothing else moved, yet the echo of that sound reverberated within me. In that charged instant, I recognized that this was not a figment conjured by my overactive mind. It was real. This presence was real. I fumbled with my phone and managed to record a few seconds of what I could only describe as a low, mournful hum that emanated from the very walls of the attic. The sound was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a dirge for forgotten souls. As the recording continued, I saw the figure gradually recede, melting back into the surrounding gloom as if it had never been there at all. Before I could decide on my next course of action, a clatter upstairs startled me from the recording's trance. The sound of heavy footsteps, deliberate and echoing, trailed from above. I glanced toward the only door leading further into the darkness, a narrow doorway that I'd always assumed led only to storage or old bedrooms. Now it pulsed with an eerie, inviting glow. With each beat of my heart, I felt the pull of an unseen force urging me to follow the sound. Against every instinct screaming at me to flee, I moved toward that door. My hand brushed against cold, peeling wallpaper that seemed almost to tremble in anticipation. I pushed the door open slowly, and a new corridor revealed itself, a long, narrow passage lined with faded photographs and dust-covered relics. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, until they almost drowned out my own panicked breathing. I forced myself forward, using the beam of my phone to guide my steps. Every door along the corridor was slightly ajar, as though each one carried a secret waiting to be unveiled. At the far end, I discovered a door that was slightly different from the rest. Its surface was smudged with streaks of dark, dried blood. I couldn't tell if it was real or merely the play of shadows, but it filled me with a cold, aching dread. With trembling determination, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room that looked more like a forgotten study than part of the main house. A single, time-worn desk stood in one corner, and above it, on the wall, hung an ornate mirror in an intricately carved frame. The air in that room was even colder than the corridor, and it seemed to vibrate with the echoes of the past. There, at the desk, lay a battered leather journal with yellowed pages. I picked it up, the weight of it sending a shiver down my spine. As I opened the journal, a message was scrawled across the first page in shaky, desperate handwriting. "I am trapped in these walls. Remember me. They took everything, my name, my love, my life. The faded ink and the style of the letters suggested a century-old sorrow, a tragedy that had long been buried. At that moment, I felt a presence behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck that made my skin crawl. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The silence was absolute, as if the very air had held its breath. I clutched the journal to my chest, unsure if it was a warning, a plea, or a confession. Then came another whisper, clearer this time, and almost pleading. "Help me." The voice was soft, yet imbued with immense sorrow. It tugged at my very soul as if it were a part of me long forgotten. I stepped forward, unable to resist any longer, and placed a trembling hand on the cold wall. In that contact, I felt a surge of emotions, pain, loss, and an overwhelming loneliness that mirrored my own isolation. It was as if the ghost of that lost soul reached out, desperate for acknowledgement, for someone to remember its existence. For what seemed like hours, I stood there in that small study, oscillating between terror and empathy. The whispers continued intermittently, sometimes a soft murmur, sometimes a desperate cry. I could not tell if they were coming from the walls, the floorboards, or the very air itself. All I knew was that something in this house had been broken long ago, and now the damage was not confined to wood and dust, but to the fragile remnants of human hearts. The storm outside reached a fevered pitch, and lightning illuminated the room in jagged bursts. In one such flash, I saw a glimpse of a face in the mirror above the desk, a face drawn with heartbreak and despair. In that split second, I understood that the specter was not my enemy, but a wounded soul reaching out for release. The diary and the shattered reflections were fragments of a history steeped in forgotten pain, a life that had been taken away by circumstances too terrible to bear. I resolved then to do something. I had to remember. I had to honor the plea of this unseen presence by discovering its story, by piecing together the fragments of a long-forgotten tragedy. I dashed down the corridor back to the living room, clutching the journal as if it were a lifeline, and started to search through the house for clues, old letters tucked behind faded wallpaper, photographs hidden under loose floorboards, and even records of local deaths archived in a dusty family cabinet. Every discovery deepened the mystery. I found an old newspaper clipping from 1912 detailing a bitter tragedy. A young woman, known only by her first name, Eleanor, had vanished mysteriously after a scandalous affair within this very house. Rumors had swirled for years, whispers of betrayal, sorrow, and a restless spirit left behind. The journal's writing mirrored the style of those days, and the despair was unmistakable. As the night wore on, I felt the presence drawing nearer. Shadows crept along the walls, and I could sense the ghost's watchful eyes tracking my every move. I began to fear that by delving too deeply, I might awaken forces far beyond my control. Yet, every fiber of my being screamed that I could not abandon Eleanor to the silence of the attic forever. I had to remember her. I had to set her spirit free. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps behind me, the same slow, measured thuds from earlier, echoed again from the staircase. I backed away from the desk, journal in trembling grip, as the sound became nearer, and then paused right at the threshold of the study. My pulse raced, and for a frozen moment, the world seemed to slow. Then, as if in response to my silent plea, the door behind me creaked open. I spun around and caught sight of the ghostly figure emerging from the shadow of the corridor, its hollow eyes fixed upon me with an intensity that cut through the darkness. There was no malice in its gaze, only an overwhelming, unfulfilled longing for recognition and resolution. The figure's voice, now clear as crystal in my mind, murmured, "I'm so tired. Please, help me remember." The plea resonated through me, echoing the quiet sorrow that I had felt in the cold touch against the wall. I whispered in response, "I will not let you fade away. I'll remember, I promise." The specter's form wavered, as though caught between existence and oblivion. I felt an almost tangible weight lifting from the room as the ghost's features softened. For a moment, the oppressive dread eased, replaced by an inexplicable compassion. I reached out toward the figure, but as my fingers neared the ephemeral form, it dissipated like smoke in the wind, leaving only a fading echo of its desperate call. In that silence, I understood that the entity's message was not to instill terror, but to remind me of the human cost of forgotten history. With the journal clutched tight and a determination to uncover Eleanor's truth, I left the attic and returned to the living room. My hands still shook as I sat at the dining table, surrounded by documents and clippings that painted a tragic tapestry of love, betrayal, and loss spanning over a century. The storm raged on outside, but within me, a quiet resolve took root. I spent hours piecing together Eleanor's story from scraps of old records, family anecdotes long buried under time, and the raw confessions of a heartache so deep it echoed in every creak of my home. I learned that she had been silenced by those who feared her scandalous beauty and fierce passion, a woman whose memory was deliberately erased. It seemed the house itself had been complicit in keeping her secret hidden, only now demanding that someone acknowledge the truth. By the time dawn broke, pale light streamed through the windows, and the oppressive atmosphere began to recede. I had gathered enough evidence to honor her memory. I printed out clippings, transcribed parts of the old diary passages, and even made a promise to myself to share her story with anyone who would listen. As I set my things in order, I felt one last, soft whisper brush past my ear, a gentle thank you, or perhaps a plea for forgiveness, echoing in the quiet morning air. Even now, as I write these words in the safety of daylight, I can't shake the lingering presence of that night. I still hear faint footsteps in the attic on stormy evenings. Sometimes I catch myself glancing upward, wondering if Eleanor's gaze still follows me, silently urging me to remember her story, and the haunting truth that every home, every old relic, carries the weight of forgotten souls. I've since moved on and left that house behind, but the memory of that night remains etched into my very being. In our modern lives, we often dismiss the quiet spaces of our past, the dark corners of memory. But sometimes, in the stillness of a stormy night, when the only sound is that of a lonesome heartbeat and the soft thumps from above, we are reminded that everything has a history. And sometimes, what watches from the attic is not here to harm us. It is here to be remembered. I will carry Eleanor's story with me always, as a reminder to honor every lost voice and to listen closely to the whispers in the dark. For in remembering, we might just set the restless souls free, and in doing so, perhaps finally find peace for ourselves. The watching in the attic is my testament to the eerie truth that even in our solitude, the past will always find a way to reach us. And as long as there are secrets hidden in the rafters, someone, somewhere, is watching. If you ever find yourself driving alone at night, maybe after a night drinking with friends, getting off work late, or pushing yourself to reach a distant destination, refusing to stop for rest, and suddenly you're on a road that doesn't appear on your GPS or map, unsure how you even got there, you may have unknowingly been selected by 7 Turns Road. Take a deep breath and follow this guide exactly. I've traveled this road myself many times. There is no turning back, no stopping, only forward. First off, you need to understand something. You were chosen, and I have no idea why. There are no rituals, no secret incantations, or hidden routes to memorize. Believe me, I've looked for patterns. I've tried to outsmart it, and I've failed every time. The truth is simple and unsettling. You'll never find 7 Turns Road intentionally. It finds you. At first, it's subtle. After making just one turn, your original route blends seamlessly into an endless stretch that feels both familiar and surreal. It doesn't matter where you were originally heading. You'll know with absolute certainty you're truly on 7 Turns Road when the temperature abruptly plummets and roadside signs blur, warp, or become nonsensical, dreamlike symbols, distorted letters, upside-down markers. You'll feel it deep in your gut. Don't fixate on the signs. That's how it tricks you into losing control. You can slow down, even stop briefly. Hell, if panic sets in hard enough, you can step outside for a breath, but never, ever make it a habit. Those who get comfortable leaving their vehicle don't tend to survive. Read carefully, memorize these steps, and accept the reality you've entered. The only path out is straight ahead. Continue along the road. Wherever you started will feel somewhat familiar, yet increasingly distant. Eventually, this stretch will lead you to a second turn. Your car's radio will switch on automatically. Attempts to turn it off or adjust the volume will fail. At first, you'll hear a faint white noise that gradually evolves into a woman's soft muttering, indecipherable gibberish that slowly transforms into coherent words, spilling out your darkest secrets, hidden truths you've told no one. I was terrified the first few times, but keep your eyes glued to the road. Your headlights are your only illumination, and you cannot afford to crash. Ignore the woman and drive until the next turn appears. By the third turn, any lingering familiarity of your surroundings will vanish entirely. A dense, oppressive forest will surge upwards, its thick, tangled branches arching overhead to form an almost suffocating canopy, enclosing you completely. On either side of the road, animals will appear, standing impossibly still, a fox, a squirrel, a bear, a bird, all fixed like grotesque statues. Their empty, hollow eyes will lock onto your every movement, heads slowly pivoting in unnatural synchronization as your vehicle passes. Keep driving. Do not acknowledge them. They aren't animals, not anymore. They're mere husks, puppeteered by the road itself as silent watchers. If curiosity compels you to glance again, and trust me, you shouldn't, you'll notice those husks beginning to distort, melting as if made from wax beneath a relentless flame. First sloughs away in thick, wet clumps, revealing slick, gleaming surfaces beneath, like dark, chitinous exoskeletons. Eyes liquefy, dribbling slowly from their sockets in streams of viscous decay. The forest around you fills with the sickly sound of dripping, the quiet cracks and pops of joints shifting beneath unraveling skin. Eyes forward. Keep your foot steady on the gas. Pretend you don't see them, because I assure you, they see you. At the fourth turn, your fuel gauge will begin to plummet alarmingly fast. Your headlights will flicker intermittently. Remain calm. The road is enticing you to exit your vehicle. Do not. You're safe if you remain inside. Your speedometer will become erratic, but maintain a steady, comfortable speed. The radio's whispering will grow louder, clearer. The woman's voice will narrate every tiny detail of your existence, each blink, heartbeat, every breath you take, even the sweat dripping down your back onto your seat. Pay her no mind. Your focus must remain solely on the road until the next turn. On the fifth turn, a gentle snowfall begins, serene at first, softly coating your car. Normally, it might be calming, but the snow quickly intensifies. You'll notice your hearing fading alongside the thickening snowfall. The harsh wind buffeting your vehicle will abruptly stop. Your engine sounds will disappear, followed by your own panicked breathing. All you'll have left is a faint ringing in your ears. Visibility deteriorates until your headlights barely illuminate the blizzard. This snow goes on endlessly, miles upon miles. Do not look to the sides. Those silent, shadowy silhouettes will crawl toward your slowly moving car, attempting to pry their way inside or distract you into veering off the path. If you panic and leave the road, there's no returning. Some shadows will dash suddenly in front of your car. My advice? Pretend they're not there and keep driving. Eventually, you'll encounter a sign, ever-changing, surreal, similar to those at the first turn. Each glance away alters its appearance, but it signals your sixth turn. Right after passing this shifting sign, turn right immediately. Do not miss it. On the sixth turn, your hearing will gradually return. The relentless snowstorm, which seemed eternal, will abruptly cease, melting away rapidly, and leaving you alone on the road. The road itself will deteriorate, becoming rough and worn before shifting into gravel. Your car will shake violently, rattling over every pebble and rock. Soon, these sounds will grow louder, heavier, disturbingly similar to the snapping and breaking of bones beneath your tires. An open field will suddenly stretch out around you, filled with hundreds, perhaps thousands of tall, dark figures. Initially, you might mistake them for dead, leafless trees, but they will begin to slowly, unsteadily move toward your vehicle. The smallest of these entities tower nearly 10 feet, while the largest stretch close to 20. Their elongated forms resemble charred bone fused with twisted bark. They possess smooth, featureless faces and deep, hollow mouths emitting anguished voices, cries, screams, and pleas of those you've loved, lost, or failed. You'll feel an overwhelming urge to stop and help them. Resist it. Accelerate as quickly as possible. The sound of cracking bones beneath your wheels, combined with their sorrowful cries, will make this turn one of the worst you've encountered. While slow, they will inch closer. Speed past them. As you approach the final turn, a profound sense of relief and accomplishment will flood through you. You'll feel as if you've narrowly escaped digestion by something monstrous and spat back out into safety. This turn will be deceptively beautiful, almost rewarding, adorned with climbing roses and vibrant flowers. Euphoria will briefly fill you until your headlights begin to flicker, your dashboard lights flash erratically, and every warning signal activates simultaneously. Your vehicle will abruptly die, coasting to a complete stop. With one final flicker of your headlights, utter darkness, deeper than any you've known, will consume you. This is the final test. The road will determine your fate. Remain inside, silent and still. You'll soon hear tapping and knocking against windows, doors, even beneath your car. Countless entities will circle and inspect your vehicle, breathing heavily and scratching at the exterior. Hold tightly to your steering wheel. Do not brake or attempt to restart your car. Your car will begin shifting as they're pushing it towards something immense. You'll hear shuffling footsteps rapidly retreat, fearful. Then, something massive will open wide. Though invisible in the darkness, you'll sense its enormity. Your car will shift downward, your stomach plummeting as adrenaline floods your veins. A sudden drop will follow. Your vehicle will slowly descend into something terrible, crushing and grinding around you. You'll hear the car being chewed apart, the metal shredding. Sharp edges will puncture through the floor, roof, and sides. Something will scrape your flesh. The vehicle will compress tighter, the roof pressing inches from your face, the sound of destruction deafening. Then, with a final, sickening spin, you'll plummet, spiraling until consciousness fades. You'll awaken gasping on a quiet roadside, the exact place 7 Turns Road first claimed you. Feel the grass, the dirt beneath your fingers. Breathe deeply. You've survived, for now. But surviving once doesn't mean freedom forever. I've traveled this road more times than sanity should allow, and each escape comes at a heavier price. Keep this guide safe, because the road won't forget you. Even as I finish typing this from the supposed safety of my driveway, I look up, and where my house should be stands an endless road stretching onward, signs distorted and beckoning. 7 Turns Road calls me again.